City Planning Commission meeting. We'll begin our meeting with a roll call.
Good evening, Commissioners. Commissioner Milstein.
Here.
Commissioner Mills.
Here.
Commissioner Gibb-Randall.
Here.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Here.
Commissioner Briggs.
Here.
Commissioner Sauve.
Here.
Commissioner Trudeau.
Here.
Commissioner Weatherby.
Here.
Commissioner Woods.
Here.
The full power of the Planning Commission this evening.
Happy spring. Do we have any introductions this evening?
No.
Thank you. Do you have a commissioner that will move the agenda? Moved by Commissioner Mills, seconded by Commissioner Gibb-Randall. Any discussion or changes on the agenda? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? It's approved. Minutes of previous meetings, we don't have any of those this evening. Reports from city administration, city council, planning manager, planning commission officers and committees, written communications and petitions. We'll begin with our city council representative, Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was a long meeting last night. 3 items I want to bring to your attention. The first is with regards to the center of the city. In November of 2018, the electorate of the city passed Proposal A, which puts forward that the property known as the library lot above the 5th and Division parking structure, underground parking structure, to be dedicated to Civic Commons. To take the next steps in that endeavor, City Council will be establishing a task force to pursue and explore what can happen there. Of note to this body is that applications will be written by the Parks Advisory Commission, and ideally the task force will be seated by around July. Because this is a civic center and parks design, a lot of the similar expertise required for planning commission would probably be desirable for this task force. And so we're looking for, among other skill sets, architects, landscape architects, and engineers. The next item was a resolution that passed directing the city administrator to collaborate with the Ann Arbor Housing Commission to explore affordable housing options on a series of downtown properties that include the Klein lot, the Carytown lot, 415 West Washington, and the 400 block of North Ashley. And finally, with respect to road redesign, there's been a lot of community dialogue about what sort and what degree of public engagement is necessary for street redesign. A resolution was passed last night that did 2 things. The first was to hold staff to a higher standard around community engagement with respect to street redesign. The second element was to make certain that City Council be the final decision maker for any major street redesigns that include things like street diets, which, as we know, can contribute to reducing carbon emissions and make cycling and pedestrian safety safer. So those are the 3 updates I had for you from last night. Long agenda, 3 items for you.
Thank you. Mr. Leonard.
Good evening. Just briefly prepping you for the working session scheduled for next week. We got 3 items anticipated for that working session. We'll be taking your next look at an updated sign ordinance, which staff and a consultant have been working on. So looking forward to presenting an update to you in that regard. We will also have a ordinance required pre-petition plan unit development presentation to the Planning Commission by petitioners seeking an altered site plan for 2857 Packard. This is a site that was previously zoned R1E. Site plan was denied, and they are seeking a plan unit development application. So this is a required step in that process. And then finally, with your generous extension of the time frame for that meeting, we'll also be revisiting a application to amend the office district to provide for some restaurant use in that district based on potentially on certain sizes of parcels.
Thank you. Planning Commission officers and committees, are there any reports? Commissioner Gibb-Randall.
Yeah, from Environmental Commission. This actually is Energy Commission via Environmental Commission. The Energy Commission will be working on a solar access ordinance that will be coming our way at some point in terms of what buildings, homes are allowed in terms of their own ability to gain solar for solar energy. So stay tuned, and that will be coming our way at some point.
Thank you. Else? Written communications and petitions, we have a couple of items that was included in our packet this evening. Audience participation. At this time, I'd like to invite any audience, anybody who is in the audience, to address the Planning Commission in regards to items that are not on our agenda this evening. There will be time for you to discuss the items that are on our agenda for this evening, but is there anyone here in the audience who wishes to address the Planning Commission in regards to an item that is not on on our agenda for this evening? If so, please step up to the podium, state your name and address for the record, and drop your
Cool.
slip in.
Hi, my name is Karen White. I live at 2719 Cranbrook, and I'm here in preparation for your deliberations on the 2857 Packard rezoning, which a large number of my neighbors and I are very much against. We don't think it's a good plan, and we don't think it's a good use of a very scarce resource. As far as we're concerned, they're not making more 300-year-old trees in Ann Arbor, and they're not making more real estate in Ann Arbor. So we want whatever development goes there to be the best. We're also very concerned about the water running off that property once all those trees are removed. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Tom Stolberg, 1202 Traver. Not at the last council meeting last night, but the prior one, there was a discussion involving proposed PUD. So it's some things that were said at that are relevant to this body because of the discussion of PUDs, and that was about the Lockwood development, which did not pass. There was almost like two different conversations going on simultaneously. So Councilmember Bannister brought something up that she's brought up before, and Councilmember Ackerman then mentioned that he wanted to set the record straight because every time she brings this up, he felt he needed to set the record straight, and he didn't think what she was saying was accurate. However, they were having a different conversation. This is about the Lower Town PUD. What Councilmember Bannister and other council members like Councilmember Eaton were talking about was the failure to approve the Morningside site plan, the current site plan, as a PUD, which the property was zoned. Effectively, by not approving that development as a PUD, but approving a site plan with variances and conditional zoning, the developer was given a PUD with everything except one thing, and that was a requirement for the community benefit. Now, Mr. Ackerman mistakenly thought that Councilmember Bannister was talking about the prior PUD, which was by the Strathmore Company, I believe a 2006 PUD. And that one's expired, and that's not what Councilmember Bannister or Councilmember Hayner or Councilmember Eaton was talking about. The problem with taking a site that was master plan and zone PUD and giving it a PUD with everything but stripping it of the name PUD was that we lost the community benefit. And as you'll see, along with the PUD that you're going to be discussing later tonight, that community benefit can be measured. 15% of the units is affordable housing. In that case, it's about 620 units. That's about a little over 90 units of affordable housing on site that were not built. Or the formula still needs to be determined. There's one variable that has to go with, there's a formula, but one variable that council needs to set. But we can measure it in terms of dollars as a payment in lieu to the Affordable Housing Fund, which the other one tonight is, it's in your packet on that. Same formula, same variable missing, but the estimate would be approximately $10 million that was lost to the Affordable Housing Fund by not approving the Morningside PUD, the Morningside site plan as a PUD, but giving them giving the developer everything the PUD would have except the requirement for that community benefit. That's what they were talking about.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to address the Planning Commission regarding an item that is not on our agenda this evening?
Hi, Tim Hall here to speak on parking minimums. I was recently in San Diego and took notice of the fact that they voted to eliminate parking minimums near transit. This seems like a great idea. By imposing parking minimums, we are effectively forcing people to pay for parking whether they want it or not, and reducing the incentives for walking, biking, and public transit. By eliminating parking minimum, we can also reduce the cost of housing, which is a significant issue in Ann Arbor, and encourage more use of alternative modes of transit. I'd encourage the Planning Commission to look at doing something like this because we want to encourage more alternative modes of transit, particularly with climate change being a real issue, and also the desire for more walkable communities and not seeing all these seas of parking that people build because they're required to. And yeah, so this is, yeah, I wanted to bring this up and hope you consider something like that in the future.
Thank you so much. Anybody else wishes to address the Planning Commission in regards to an item that is not on the agenda? Seeing no one, we'll move on in our agenda. Public hearings scheduled for the next business meeting. Mr. Leonard.
We have no new public hearings scheduled for the next regular business meeting. So my proposal is we keep that valuable space on your calendars and see how the working session goes next week. And I will likely fill it with something even if we get through everything on the night.
Could I request that people use their microphones? Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to unfinished business. The first item for us this evening is 841 Broadway Street PUD zoning and conceptual plan for city council approval. Our procedure for this evening will be for the petitioner to make his or her presentation. Afterwards, we'll get city report, public hearing, and then we will move on to discussion. So we'll start with the petitioner's presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for the opportunity to come before you. Just a few moments of overview in terms of what was presented to you in advance of this meeting. When we came away from what we thought was a very healthy discussion with the Planning Commission last month, we regrouped with planning staff to really try to hone in on the modifications to the proposed regulations that we believed would address the comments both that we heard from Commission and that we heard from residents in the community. I just want to take a few moments in hopes that I can once again master your there it is, to just highlight those changes because I feel that the Commission has seen the base regulations. I believe was provided what I hope was a carefully redlined modification to highlight the changes. But I wanted to spend a few moments talking about kind of the genesis of those because it was a good, healthy exercise we went through with the staff. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about the park components. What we heard from the Commission, it was that there was generally, in our view, a lot of consensus around the components that are being put forward, but that the Commission wanted to see a baseline, wanted to see certain items that were, under any and all circumstances, as we move forward through this process, going to be a part of any future plan. And so we did add specific requirements. We really pulled things that were in the list of things we were all aspiring to and decided to just put them in the required items in advance of any ultimate approval. Those items include the watercraft launch, the 2 additional access points, and the walkway from one end of the property to the other. I feel like it's probably worthwhile to also point out, because we kind of blew through it pretty quickly, there was a lot to go over last time, about the things that were already embedded in those regulations. And so I felt we felt it was important to re-highlight that the plan already called for a minimum of 6 acres of public space in the overall plan, that it already called for something that I think is important, because I think it got lost last time. There's a lot of valuable debate about the merits of the course of the river over the last 120 years. We sort of figure that's above our pay grade. The river is supported by the dam, however, we recognize that, and I think the city legitimately had concerns that the dam needs support. So the regulations also call for substantial investment into the dam in support of this project, but really in support of the community. Financial support for affordable housing we did touch on, and the LEED Silver certification, and of course, the substantial remediation of the site. Pardon me. There we are. Pulling forward from the back of the regulations because it relates to it, I think we also had a healthy dialogue about the Conservancy model, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about how the Conservancy works, how it should be governed, and how it should operate by the time this project achieves fruition. We elected, in working with the Planning Commission, to embed those requirements into the regulations as well. What you see in front of you are really the key points of that. I don't want to revisit them, but for the benefit of the community, it certainly calls for the formation of the 501c3, the establishment of the board of directors, participation on that board of directors, as most conservancies include both members of the immediate surrounding community, but also members of the city and parks organization. And more importantly, because we think this also was something we heard loud and clear out of the community, and something we're committed to, is that we need to establish a baseline of funding. So what the regulations call for is a baseline of $1 million that forms that conservancy and establishes it, but by no means is the end of the process that involves funding that conservancy to operate in perpetuity. Boy, hand-eye coordination tonight. We also spent quite a bit of time on something that we were fairly confident was moving in the right direction. I think after our most recent meeting and the gap between our last meeting and this one really gave us an opportunity to visit with the Parks Advisory Commission itself the plan for a secondary means of access. We shared this plan with the Parks Advisory Commission in this very same room. I think we had a good dialogue there. No action was required of the commission at that meeting or asked for. What we really wanted to understand was, in our view, whether anyone saw any issues relative to this plan that we should bring back to this effort or we should incorporate it into it. I won't speak for the commission, but I will tell you what I heard. And what I heard was that I believe the members of the commission, to a member, saw this as an obvious and an appropriate solution. I think they recognize the work is on us to come back with final engineering plans and specifications for this. Before that commission, our team walked the site again to make sure we weren't overlooking any obvious concerns associated with this. And I think everybody sees it as a logical solution for the appropriate need for emergency access. To that end, and I guess I'll just highlight this, we have continued our dialogues with Amtrak because this involves them as well. We have another call with them tomorrow on our monthly calls. As I said in the prior meeting, and I just more for the benefit of our residents in the room, Amtrak also is aware that this is a critical part of the plan and also sees it as a logical and appropriate emergency solution. In the kind of the old-fashioned nitty-gritty of zoning ordinances, we heard an awful lot in the last meeting and spent some time saying, what about this plan is leaving cause for concern for what we're hoping to achieve at this stage? And I want to take a moment to step back on that and say, because the question came up, why follow the process that we're following, which is first rezone, then site plan? Obviously, there's a great deal of complexity in a site like this, but it really comes back to we want to understand that we have a shared set of rules for the exercise that follows, and that is the deeper dive into site plans in these multiple uses. And we recognized, frankly, following the conversation that we had last month, that there remained some gaps and gores, if you will, between what our plan shows, which I would suggest most people see as a good outcome, and some room in those regulations. We never viewed that as an opportunity to materially change the plan. We obviously, as developers and as planners, want to make sure that we have minimal wiggle room as we move through a plan and really engage with the site at the level of construction documentation and site plan. But what we felt that we could do is clearly pare back on that gap so that there would be more confidence by this body that if it was approving the rule book, that the likely outcome that follows from that rule book is unequivocally the plan that you see in front of you or something darn close to it. And so we looked at that and we made some modifications, the most obvious of which was something that, frankly, I already had in my head and wasn't on the regulations, is that we have no intention and frankly, desire to break the rough height dimensions of the residential. And so we pulled that back to 80 feet. We feel that gave us more than enough room to produce the buildings that you see that we had depicted in the prior meeting. And with some, like I said, wiggle room, so we don't have to come in for a minor variance because of a roof element or something that's protruding above that. I think the floor area ratio was another very good point. And what we did and spent a lot of time with Smith Group and Hamilton Anderson is said, let's program these buildings, and what if each one of them had to grow in this direction or that direction? What's a reasonable amount of what I would characterize as play in these buildings, knowing what we've shown on this plan, to allow us to develop what we're developing without having to come in for variances. But this is not an opportunity to build another building on the site. It's literally an opportunity to define these buildings more carefully. So we cut that back from 124% to 80%. I think setbacks were important, and I think we heard loud and clear the questions raised really mostly about the hospitality. And so those are the ones we focused on. We felt the other setbacks were appropriate. And so we wanted to ask for a minimum setback from the river of 20 feet. Now, bear in mind, in our current plan, there is literally only one building that would even come close to that, and that is obviously the hospitality. What this image is intended to depict is that is 20 feet from the property line. And so because there seemed to be some concern that somehow or another that was going to close off the public access that we're trying to achieve. Of course, it doesn't accomplish that. In fact, what we're drawing right now is I would say, in excess of that by a few feet. But we felt that 20 foot was something that would protect for that outcome. And then a minimum of 10 feet setback from Broadway, because there was some concern there as well. So those were two items that were not in the prior plans. I am down to like what looks like seconds, so I'm going to wrap up here quickly. Oh, and then the rest of them I'll take in questions, but I apologize for running over, and we're more than happy to follow up with dialogue. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I think I can finish up, right? Or no?
I took it
No,
all.
not on this one?
I
Okay.
apologize. I'm usually better than that. I'm sorry.
All right. At this time, we'll head over to Mr. Kowalski for the staff report.
There's only a couple of other items that I wanted to touch on that. Thank you. Okay. A couple of additional items I want to touch on that weren't covered. Actually, probably by the slide here, you can see it. One of the concerns we heard last time regarding that parking ratio and the number of how we had calculated it before. So as you can see on the slide here, and is represented in the supplemental regulations, we went back to kind of more the traditional count. These aren't quite like hotel. Right now in our code is 1 space per room, so it's slightly reduced a little bit. But it does allow the wiggle room, and it does allow for some, it does allow for extra, or enough parking, I should say, not extra. And it also does include or it will include the 50 additional spaces on top of what's required for the uses that they program at the site. The 50 additional spaces would be designated for public use only, so in general, it would be intended for the high canoe livery, the open space, and things like that. One of the key features also that is, if you remember from before, we were kind of having a discussion with the developer regarding the requirement of a structure, whether parking would be structured on the site or not. So I think we came to what I think is a productive solution in that the supplemental regulations, as well as the plan, they'd be revised to say that if the parking is all provided on site, 50% of the parking would be structured, which is what we had. What staff has been requesting previously. However, the developer also wanted the ability for some flexibility and is optimistically, I hope, working with Amtrak on the adjacent lot to allow for some shared parking. This accomplishes some of the goal, I think, in this plan, which was for us to kind of minimize the amount of surface space, still make sure that we do have enough parking because obviously, as you know, we don't want to provide over parking, but there's a lot of uses on the site and there's a lot of flexibility on when these uses will occur and the peaks for some of them. So I think with the shared parking, it accomplishes the same goal, where we can have enough parking, but yet, in the case that there wouldn't be, this parking, surface parking would not sprawl out. So with that, we have allowed the provision to share parking with the adjacent property. Now, as part of that shared parking, I think an additional public benefit for the city would be out of that is as if you know, or many of you probably know by now, that is a pretty unimproved lot, that Amtrak lot. It's, I think at one point, kind of a gravelly surface, or I mean, it's asphalt, but it's deteriorated. So in order to be used as a shared parking, it would need to be upgraded to today's parking standards, which would include detention, landscaping, and things along those lines. So that could be a definite benefit for the city. So that is a significant change from the previous regulations that you did see that would allow, in summary, basically, if all parking's on site, 50% has to be structured, but it does allow the ability for them to share parking off-site. I think some of the other, most of the other ones were covered. I wanted to touch on the, well, the height was also a big one, but we did touch on the height previously. That was another issue that we know was a definite concern for the Planning Commission. Going through here, really, that was kind of it of how we shored up the, or tightened up the supplemental regulations a little bit. And if you would see, it was mentioned previously, the last, there's been modifications to the last paragraph or the last item of the supplemental regulations regarding the 501c3 for the open space and when that would be dedicated prior to CO. So that would be included within the supplemental regulations. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Staff is still recommending approval.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to open up the public hearing. Anybody in the audience? This is your time to address the Planning Commission in regards to this agenda item. You'll have 3 minutes to speak before the commission. This is time for public hearing. If anybody would like to address the Planning Commission in regards to this item, please stand up to the podium. State your name and your name and address for the record, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak before the Planning Commission.
Tom Stolberg again, 1202 Traver Street.
That was quick.
Wow. It says 7:05, by the way. Overall, I'm in support of this project. I'd like to thank the development team. The public engagement from them has been wonderful. It really stands far above other public engagements that I've... The public engagement from the developer stands well above what other developers have done, and I really appreciate that. I think PUD is the appropriate zoning category for this site. I think it's interesting what they're doing with the area plan now and site plan later, but as long as you're all figuring out how to make that work, it can work. When we first talked about this site, you know, a lot of people were hopeful, as was the landowner and developer of this site, that the train station could somehow be incorporated into this, whatever happens at the depot site. As was I. The Fuller Road station is dead. The funding that was available or thought to be available at one time is no longer a possibility or feasibility. And it's a shame that we've let that go so long, but the developer had to move forward. The landowners waited and been patient, and it's time to not wait for us, even though I can't see the Fuller Road station going through. But I thank them for their patience and holding out, and wish it was part of this project, but it isn't. When I first heard there was a hotel as part of this development, this is, you know, going back a little ways, I was like, But I didn't know so much about hotels, and since then I've learned about hotels, and hopefully I've got a May 1st closing as part of a partnership on a hotel project. So surprise, you learned something, and I think it is a feasible thing for this site after all. The ingress egress, a single non-emergency access off the bridge, to me, I can't imagine it working, but on the other hand, I'm not a traffic engineer, and if they can figure it out, oh, great. I would support the project if they can figure out how to make that work. It just seems like a challenge, but I'm open to see them solving that problem. The height of the hotel, that's the one sticking point for me at this point. 9 stories at that location is going to stand out. Nothing around it in that view shed except it. It's going to be a monolith. The Kellogg Eye Center is not far away on paper, but as you approach the site from many different angles, almost every angle, it's not in the same sight line. This will be standing quite alone. And I have not heard much about that, except from other neighbors who agree that we can't envision a 9-story structure there. So I'd like to see that addressed and discussed, hopefully, this evening by the planning commissioners. Other than that, I think it's a great project. The developer offers quite a lot. It's a mixed-use development, which is appropriate for the location. We need retail in that area, and they're offering wonderful amenities to the public. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Ethel Potts, 1014 Elder Boulevard. Can you hear me? What this represents, this development, is what the developer wants to develop. It is what he tends to develop. It has nothing much to do with what is needed at this portion of town. Your job is to do planning. If you were planning from scratch on a vacant piece of land, what is it that you would, what kind of uses would you think were appropriate here? I do not think this is what they really need here is some of what they had before, like a major grocery store. They could use some offices, like medical or dental or lawyers' offices, and retail, convenience retail, so that they don't, so the people here don't have to drive all the way out Plymouth Road to get even the least little thing. There's nothing much available here. So what is good planning for this area? That's your job. As far as I'm concerned, you are representing the citizens of Ann Arbor as to what is good planning for any one piece of land. And there are several neighborhoods here. It isn't just Broadway. It's also all the townhouses that are along the river. I think up Traver, the whole neighborhood up Traver, the whole neighborhood on Pontiac. There are a whole section of residential areas that lack any amenities to go with residential. What is not needed here is more residential. I think the traffic that's going to be caused there at Lower Broadway Bridge, at the north side of Broadway Bridge, is going to be horrendous because we already have traffic problems there. And this is going to add that many more people with their cars. The open space that I first saw was, maybe they were improving that, but at first it was sort of a stingy little bit of setback from the important creek. I'm going to be listening to how you each of you explains how this is the suitable use and development for this area. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Stevenson Ramsburg. I live at 1007 Wright Street, perched basically right above the river. So I think that the major blind spot, and I also want to echo Tom and everybody. I appreciate the developers allowing us input on this, and I do think it's a good project, and I'm in support of it. The major blind spot is the height of the hotel and the location of the hotel. It's too tall, and it's too close to the river. If you allow them to put a 9-story building right there, it'll set a precedent. Ann Arbor, whether intended to or not, has done a good job of keeping the river a green space, a wide open path. Now, you put this hotel there, and you bottleneck traffic right there so that cars coming into this area have to pass by the hotel and the retail. It almost makes this an exclusive island. And it's not an island, it's the city. And I think the developers are seeing this from the inside out, as they should. But as, you know, citizens, as the neighbors to this, we're seeing it from the outside in. And from everybody I talk to, no one likes the hotel. I think it can be moved back. I think it can be addressed. As they have listened to our concerns, I haven't seen any kind of change in the placement of the hotel, and I think that's the #1 concern of the citizens. The image that we saw earlier and the image right here, it doesn't reflect exactly what you're going to see. You're going to have a massive shadow and a monolith shading the river and a small piece of land, a scrap of land to get under the bridge that connects it to the dog park. So I hope you all take all that into consideration. This will be permanent. This won't go away. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rita Mitchell. I'm at 621 Fifth Street, and I've been a long proponent of keeping the train station where it is on Depot Street. And I like what I've heard from the developer in terms of working together with Amtrak, and I could see that being something that could be improved over time and perhaps even more coordinated with parking. And I truly hope that the approach to the train station is one that keeps it where it is, and that parking and other access can be improved. For the particular project, my concerns have to do with the environmental aspects, the cleanup, and making sure that it's thorough. And I'm concerned that there may be a shifting of the responsibility from DTE, the current owner, to our brownfield funds. And I'm wondering, I really consider that questionable in terms of its fairness, in terms of the financial responsibility. I don't know if that's something that you all deal with here, but brownfield cleanup is something that we all pay as taxpayers, so it's a concern. The other thing in terms of design to be thought of, regardless of height, and I do feel there is a concern to be had with the height of the hotel, but lighting in that area, I would hope, I've heard more recently about Dark Sky's approach to lighting, so that any lighting, since it is so close to the river, there is wildlife and things that we really should try and protect. I'm quite surprised to hear 20 feet being the setback from the river as well. So those are, I think, my main concerns. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Karen Isley. I'm at 603 Swift Street, so we're ready. Oh, I'm sorry. 603 Swift Street, right across from the river. I guess one of the things, well, a couple of things that we're concerned about in that area is the traffic, of course, coming onto Broadway. It's very difficult to get through that area at about 5 o'clock, a little after 5, trying to come over the bridge. I don't know if anybody commutes that way, but it's very difficult. It's also backed up on Pontiac, coming in the morning at about 8 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock. So that traffic is going to all pool into that light that's there now, and it's going to be an issue. Also, we're very concerned about the hotel location and the height. Just visually, if you think about 20 feet, that's about from that screen to the back of that column right there. So when you talk about 20 feet off of the river, that's not very much. So I hope you'll take that into consideration, because as you're building, just trying to stay within 20 feet of that space is going to be very difficult.
Hi, I'm Ellen Ramsberg, and I live at 1503 Cambridge Road. I want to echo, but not dwell on the, sorry, but not dwell on the height and the placement of the hotel, because I did see how much the developer had addressed questions that you raised at the last meeting, but that question, which has continued to be a stumbling block for the neighborhood, has never been addressed. The height of the hotel has never been adjusted, and the pad, even though they, in the new regulations, say the pad may move, that's not really been clearly dealt with. And I think another concern is that if Roxbury is not the manager of the, or if they're not the developer of the hotel, then does that mean that the hotel developer will be adamant about height and placement? And it's such a concern for citizens that I don't want to see it lost. Another concern that I had was that the pedestrian bridge is still tied to the brownfield development money. And if they don't get as much development money as they would like through the brownfield, will that go away? And I think in your regulations, I would really like to hear that spelled out. Other measures were addressed, but that one was not. When we think about the river, the fact that just about from Dexter to Ypsilanti, there is almost no encroachment this close to the river. And I think the encroachment of only 20 feet away from our greatest asset, not giving it a real riparian buffer, and also not giving it the feeling that the river is our public domain, is a real problem with this. And I think citizens over and over have said that to you, and I hope that you will take up that case with the developer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Peter Allen. I live at 2224 Applewood Court, Ann Arbor, and I have some real estate just upriver from this along North Main right at the dam. I've been there for 25 years. We spent several $1 million fixing up those buildings, and it's all to help try to make the riverfront more accessible, more open to the public. We've been very involved in the pathway, the border-to-border trail. We've been overlooking this godforsaken site for so many years, and it's great to see somebody as talented as the Roxbury Group getting involved and trying to create a great place for people. Having 6 acres of public space, having a wonderful walkway along the water, having the best firm in the country in PPS.org and Smith Group at managing the design and the elements of that public space, having a restaurant on the river. People have been talking about it for years. So I think the idea of the height is not as germane as creating great place along the river that's open to the public. And I encourage you to endorse their plan and get going as quickly as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hello, I'm Mary Howley Wiesel. I am at 635 Swift Street, which also overlooks the Cascades directly across from the proposed site. I appreciate the time and effort expended on this proposed development. Our family has owned the same property for over 150 years, living through the railroads, the coal refinery, the trains, everything else that you could, the stockyards. So to say that we should proceed, I agree with parts of the process, but I do concur that an 8 or 9-story hotel on that site, not only will we be looking directly into that, not only is it permanent, but I really feel that the city of Ann Arbor has invested millions of dollars developing the Broadway Bridge so that it complemented the transfer from upper town to lower town to really reflect the aesthetics of historical buildings. But now we're being, in essence, force-fed that it's a good opportunity to put this hotel so close to the river, blocking any visual of the aesthetics of the Broadway Bridge, anything that you could relate historical buildings towards, and seeing a very, in this regard, a very shadowed effect. So those of us that would be living through it, it's not only the construction, but having to view that day in and day out would be a real travesty as taxpayers. So I hope that you look at, again, working with a compromise, a 4-story hotel, expand it back down towards the area south of their location. But I think there needs to be a compromise here. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dane Page, and I live at 411 Longshore Drive. I represent the Society of Les Voyageurs, which have lived there at 411 Longshore Drive for going on 100 years now in the Natural and Historic District. We've made several endeavors in the past to keep this area natural and preserving some of the woods there, including wanting to move some of the livery operations to the other side of the river, which would take additional pressure off of the Argo area. And I want to reiterate some points on what the others said on the height of the hotel and its proximity to the river. Already the 999 building on Broadway takes up some of the horizon and some of the rolling and sloping hills of Ann Arbor, which were the glacial deposits of old, which is why many people settled here in the first place. And we're always doubtful of the necessity of development, but it does seem like you have some nice plans as long as you take into consideration the chemical deposits there and what kind of runoff could come from the construction with that kind of proximity to the river. But thank you for hearing out the public on this.
Thank you. All right, seeing nobody else, I will close the public hearing. And we'll move on to reading the motion. Our motion is the Ann Arbor City Planning Commission hereby recommends that the mayor and city council approve the 841 Broadway Street PUD Plan Unit Development District zoning and area plan. Do you have a commissioner that will move? Moved by Commissioner Mills, seconded by Commissioner Gabrandel. We are in discussion. Commissioner Mills.
I have a laundry list. I thought you guys would go first, and then I could just pick off what was left. But thank you. I know that last time I was one of the people like picking out where there were discrepancies, and it's because what we write, if it gets passed, becomes the rules. And so I really think it's you did a great job at listening to what we were saying and kind of figuring out. I understand the idea of the wiggle room. Narrowing that band, I think, was really great. There are, now that I can see through like some of those big things that were glaring before, I think that there are additional things that I have questions about, but I think a lot of the steps that you've taken were really addressing a lot of those. What slides did we miss, or what was part of the presentation just that I would love to see?
Thank you. Now it's discussion time. I get to come on.
Got it.
Sorry.
Okay, so
You actually, I want to say Matt did a nice job of picking up, but if you want to know, I can.
Yeah, I saw this one. Can you go to this is the other one? No, wrong direction.
Was I going the wrong way? I apologize. I'm not that good at this. There we
Okay,
go.
so this I don't think we saw very
Didn't
much.
see this, and it dawned on me also that I missed an important point, and Commissioner Mills, this was something that I think you highlighted, which was the old version had this kind of either-or option. The either-or is gone now. This is very much, we're committed to the mixed-use development, subject to secondary access, but I think that was clear enough in the report that I just felt like it was important to point that out. There were just some, what I would characterize as open questions that couldn't immediately and unequivocally be addressed in zoning regulations, or I would say aren't appropriate to zoning regulations, that we didn't want the commission to believe were not on the table any longer. These are just items that we believe flow through a process once rules are established and come out by the end of the process. And so stormwater management, spent a lot of time on that. We really looked at what more we can say. I want to thank the Planning Commission for creating the flexibility of adjacent parking, because that adjacent parking option actually does create the opportunity for some flexible uses of rooftops. we have started to actually, the stuff, some elements that really aren't ready for prime time, but I think will come back in the site plan phase if we're fortunate enough to move to that phase. Includes also how can we utilize the pavilion, for instance, which is a concept that is very important to this, and that roof structure on stormwater management. So we were mostly focusing on not losing track of that. Listen, we figured there'd be more discussion about the hotel. So the other point was, again, this is about rules. This is about understanding the interplay of space and how these things can be used to enliven. You know, we're not obviously a development group that closes its ears to what the community is saying, and we recognize there's some trepidation about utilization of the space closer to the river for the hospitality. I think we spent some time last week explaining why that is the right home for hospitality. We want the opportunity, obviously, to present that as a realized plan, because we believe there's probably more concern than will ultimately be warranted when we do our homework on that plan. That being said, we recognize what we were presenting here today was still just the rule book. So our view of it as site plan is the place where you still hold the cards in that discussion.
Yeah, and I think, so one of my big, I mean, that's clearly one of the things that continues to come up. And so I don't know that I have the right solution. And since you guys had me go first, I will pose this to you and you can respond to this. Right now, the limits are on, how close, what's written into here is how close the hotel or whatever's on that corner could be to the river, how close it could be to the road, and there's a height limit. But I'm wondering, we don't have anything, I think that there can be beautiful tall buildings that stand, there can also be really ugly tall buildings that stand out, and there's nothing, and the design part is really hard of that, but I don't know, I pose this to you guys, because this is not normally my thing, is about whether there's something about design that we want to include in here. Mm-hmm. Or do we want to limit, for example, I'm just thinking about this as a concern, Austin downtown too. We have a limitation on the diagonal, just because right now it could be, we don't necessarily limit the footprint of this. I'm not so worried about FAR, honestly, but I could see a 115-foot tall, slender building, right, is very different than a very blocky or, I don't know. I mean, it could be very large, right? Like you could put all your FAR up there if you wanted to. And so I think I'm posing that back to us as something to consider that I'm just floating. Or to kind of limit the square footage of it. That's one option. The other thing that I would note, though, that's along with this, I have this shared, a conflict in my own mind about how close is too close to the river, because I do want to make sure that we're protecting the river, but at the same time, the idea of having a riverfront restaurant is great. Like, I mean, that was a huge asset for the city.
Understood.
One of my concerns, honestly, over the new development agreement is that it doesn't require that anymore. There's nothing that says that the only thing that's required in terms of land use, I appreciate the increasing specificity about what's required on for the park area. And it does require 90 residences, 90 residential units, but any retail use is permitted, and there's nothing that's required. And so, and even if there was a hotel there's nothing requiring that there be a restaurant in the hotel, and I don't think that we would want a hotel that close to the river if it doesn't have a restaurant that people can use. And so I'm not sure, I'm posing this kind of, again, out to us. I think that's a problem. Like, I think that there needs to be more specificity on that. I don't know what the language is. I can work on it if other people think that that's of relevance, but I think that that's one of the holes here, right? That you could still build a hotel, but it doesn't necessarily have to have a restaurant right on the river. I was going to say, like, a lot of the amenities that we like, that we were seeing on the park side, the open space side, were permitted but not required. But I think that the addition of the requirement that there's $1 million going towards maintenance is definitely a greater benefit, like maintaining a smaller set of things, in my mind, is better than building a whole bunch of stuff and not maintaining it. So I think that was a really, I appreciate that move. And that's not necessarily what we asked you for, but that's what we got. And I appreciate that. And thanks to staff for having that in there. Let's see. On the parking, so I love the idea of shared parking. We need to see more shared parking in the city. I don't love the idea that the way that the regulation is written is that you only have to have a parking garage if you have 0 off-site parking. And so I want to hear other discussion. Right now, this is like a not great version of this, but I would propose that we I don't actually want to make an amendment, but I'm going to later on have something that's about changing that the surface area for on-site parking cannot exceed 50% of the required spaces, so that if you have some amount off-site, because it's possible right now to have 10% off-site and then 90% on-site all surface parking, and I don't think that's what we want. So I don't think that serves the greater good. Yes.
I just want to clarify, in that framework, there's also a hard cap on impervious surface in either circumstance. So I think, and that impervious calculation reflects the concept plan that's presented to you. I think the question that we put forth in the first version of this and our subsequent discussions with the petition team was, that's great, but is there an opportunity for further sort of savings of impervious surface if that requirement still exists? But I want to clarify that in that circumstance that you're describing, there is still a hard cap on the impervious impact to the site in either circumstance.
Yeah, I still think that this is good. There's a lot of parking here. We know that it's just it's more costly. I get that, but it's also way more efficient to to limit imperviousness that way. So, I mean, unless other commissioners have comments on that that can sway me otherwise, that's probably a proposal an amendment that I'll make. I want to clarify with staff on page 6 of the development or whatever the regulations are, when it's talking about parking and the things that are going into the parking formulas, the electric vehicle charging station and all of this kind of stuff, does that apply also to off-site parking, those same standards if they arrange for off-site parking, or is that only the stuff that they build on their own site?
That's for all the parking they provide for the site, whether it's on-site or off-site, all the parking for these uses of the site
have to conform to that. So even if it's provided off-site, it would still have to conform to that. Yeah. I think as I was reading that, it was unclear. So I think we need to be clear.
I'm going to disagree with my colleague. What you're doing here with the planning and development is you're creating a zoning district for this property. If parking was provided on another site that is not subject to plan unit development, then the same zoning development regulations that would apply to that zoning district would do so. We would also require some documentation that those spaces are accessible to a neighboring site, but unless that property was specifically included in the PUD rezoning, which it's not at this point, then if that's something that you would like to see applied, I'm not sure the best way to impose those standards for this zoning district onto a non-included site.
Yeah.
So
I think we should at least then, again, I can come up with language, but the electric vehicle charging stations is the key one, and so that rate of providing 1 per 50, like even if I want it applied to the entire required parking, even if some of that is met off-site. So if they have 1,000 spaces, it's just easier numbers. You know what I mean? That they would provide, I don't know, what is that, 20 spaces, even if they only have 500 spaces on their site. Does that math make sense? Okay. So that's something that I'll work on writing up something according to that. And then the question, and I don't know if I'm going to start with staff but maybe this is a question for the petitioner, is I noted the same thing about funding for the upgrading the dam. Is that the way that it's written, it reads to me that they only have to fund that if they get brownfield funding. So it's a public benefit, but that's based on I don't think that's a public benefit.
So I would say it is a public benefit. It is it's a potentially a source of resources that the city can utilize that might potentially free up other resources for other uses in the city. But you are right. It is explicitly written in such a way that if it is not supported through that financing mechanism, that it would not be required.
Okay. So just to be clear, I think because there would be financing from taxpayer-funded things for this, I think that the real benefit, there is benefit in the land set aside. This one is because it's contingent on getting taxpayer dollars. For that, I would just not. That's not a done deal benefit, and it's also not directly out of this. So,
there's actually a logical answer on
okay.
that one, but I want to let you finish.
All right. I think that those were the main gist of my stuff, but I reserve the right to come back with those amendments if I hear other people moving towards that way.
We'll be back to you shortly. Commissioner Woods.
I wanted to get a clarification on one of the points that Commissioner Mills made, and that was about whether or not there'd be a restaurant there with a view of the river. That I don't know what else to do. I got it on. Okay. Whether or not there would be a restaurant there with a view of the river. And as I'm looking in one of the sections on page 5 where it's listing required principal uses, and a restaurant is listed down there, but it's listed under permitted uses. And so my question is whether or not the city has ever actually required, for example, a restaurant within a building in order for to meet the development agreement or whatever you want to call it. Because we see a lot of instances sometimes where restaurants sort of fail in projects. And so what happens in that case? And I guess that's a question for staff, but if the petitioner also has some comments, that's fine. But I wanted some clarification on that.
I don't know specifically if I can point to examples of a restaurant being required. There are definitely approvals that are contingent or conditioned upon mixed use, a mixed use requirement. That might be one way if you were uncomfortable with being so specific in requiring that specific use, that specific sort of category of commercial use. We could explore language that just puts that into sort of a commercial land use category. But on the flip side, if the petitioner is proposing, as it's written now, it is permitted, so it's not required. I think that would be it might be a substantive change to that regulation. You are really locking in that land use in a very specific manner. So if that is something that you really believe is very critical to considering approval, it might be appropriate. We did our best from a staff perspective, finding the sort of minimal base components that we think that should be achieved in any regard, and didn't include that in our recommendation.
I might be able to speak to that, Commissioner Woods.
Sure, please.
And actually, I welcome the conversation because it's getting back to what I think we sensed from the commission last time is something we all share, which is that the notion of these uses reinforcing each other not only provide vitality to the built environment, but they provide vitality to the public space. And believe me, we understand the balance. Our hope is that this body will understand that by committing a very, very small portion of the footprint along the riverfront with proper setback from the river and absolute public access in front, that they will understand that that's an important trade-off to the 1,200 feet of unbroken and if you will, completely open public space that follows from that. So that's a little bit of a commercial for why we would ask for the dispensation to present a hotel in this location at the site plan phase that the community can react positively to. What I would tell you about that hospitality is it reinforces the other things, the exact things that you're asking for. We do this for a living. Hospitality begets F&B, or food and beverage restaurants, and not just any F&B, but usually high-quality F&B. So we would rather entertain a dialogue about holding us to a high standard on that hospitality than find the conversation moving in the direction of fear of the outcome. And so whether it is, to Commissioner Mills' point, about design standards, setbacks, the sort of things you do in a downtown environment when you're concerned about things being too close to other things, not just setback at the ground, but step backs at higher levels. We welcome a set of design standards. Admittedly, we didn't incorporate those in the zoning ordinances, but I think a requirement of those prior to site plan is something we could articulate. But the actual thing that Brett might consider kind of mind-blowing, and understandably from a planning perspective, we look at as not worrisome at all. If what you're saying is, we understand that from a planning perspective, from a design perspective, from an activation perspective, a hospitality use needs to be in this location, but we want to make sure it is a high-quality hospitality use, and to us that means it has certain minimum requirements. And even issues of FAR per hospitality, for instance. We would welcome that input, those sorts of amendments, to allow us to keep moving forward and designing and developing something that the community can be proud of, than say, too much to think about, let's kick the can on that one. So we're not afraid of waterfront a restaurant. We know that what makes waterfront restaurant not only happen in this plan, but thrive in this plan is its connection to that hospitality use. And so we're hopeful that we can make, we can make 2 + 2 = 6 on that, rather than kind of stepping away. So I hope that's helpful.
That's helpful. Just another question. As we're looking at the renderings that you've given us, for example, and some of the feedback from the audience about the 9 stories on the hotel, have you actually come up with your plans for the hotel? I mean, I think it's one thing to have, a big blocky hotel there. It's another thing to have almost an iconic kind of a building there that really makes people, as they're driving by, go, ooh, or, people come to town and they say, oh, let me show you this over here by Broadway, and, wait till you see this or something. I mean, so there's opportunity to...
There is opportunity.
To do that, but I'm just curious, we've seen some blocky buildings in our times, and people just sort of turn their heads when they go by them, or they just forget even what they're looking at. So
couldn't agree more. We take this stuff pretty seriously, and I hope that the degree to which we take it seriously has been reflected in the portions of the project that have been more fully realized, specifically the residential. And we're quite excited to share the additional components that we are more close to being able to bring forward, like the pavilion, like some of the additional ancillary uses. And we'll be the first to admit that the hotel is a placeholder right now. We're trying to preserve the opportunity to develop a hotel within rules. And we're quite confident, and the image you see in front of you now was not intended to depict architecture per se, but at the same time, trying to make sure people appreciate that the same sensitivity to use of materials that we brought to the residential buildings will ultimately be brought to that hotel. I am the first one to admit, and I think anyone else on our team would be, that the placeholder of the 9-story hotel on this, the images you've seen to date, would have one say, really, is it going to look like that? And that's a fair question. And we are, as the parties looking at this, trying to create the flexibility necessary for the hotel to succeed economically, but obviously at the same time we want it to reflect well on this entire development. Everyone who's here, who's a resident of the community, says, I want something that I like having in my neighborhood, and I want to remind everybody that we're extending this neighborhood onto this park. So if we do something from a hospitality perspective there that doesn't reflect well in the view of those of our neighbors who are on the other side of the river, ask yourself how it's going to be viewed by those residents who are considering living literally on this site. So that's not obviously anything other than the point that the process improves and produces the best possible result as we move through it together. And so, quite frankly, Commissioner Woods, we're at the early stages of that. We would prefer guidelines and rules and these regulations that this body feels put enough onus on us to produce good design and allow the site plan process to be the next step in that process. We are looking forward to the moment when we can turn our full attention to that hotel, but with those rules in front of us, because we can design things in a lot of different directions. I can tell you that the impetus to 9 stories in this instance was to minimize footprint. So it actually cut in the direction of Commissioner Mills' point. There are other ways to achieve this. I will tell you that the proposition that we're trying to preserve for is in the range of 130 to 150 room hotel. This is not a massive hotel. This is the regulations that are before you, particularly with the other FAR requirements pushing against us, really won't allow us to build much more hotel than that. That is what we might call in the industry a boutique hotel. It is not a large-scale hotel. It is not, at the end of the day, all that much bigger than a residential building that might house 100 or 120 apartments. It's just us trying to use, we all recognize there are certain constraints on this site. This happens to be a location, even in the current LOMAR, and that was one of the other things we didn't touch on, but the one that we are ultimately committed to is buildable. And so in a site where we're trying to unlock the better part of 7 or 8 acres of public space, we have to take advantage of the buildable property, and this is one of those locations. But we welcome rules that this body feels will drive us to good design. We'd like to believe we're going to be driven to good design either way.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the developer, first for the public engagement process. Getting multiple compliments in a night about public engagement is certainly what we want to hear. So thank you for that. Epi, how's the volume? Can you hear me? How's the volume? Speak up. All right.
She hasn't had a problem with me, by the way.
Yeah, you're doing great. So first, just I thought I heard you say site plans plural earlier in the presentation. Could you clarify what the process will be for site plan approval?
I don't want to misspeak, but as we look at this PUD, we believe that there is the opportunity to present a single site plan or to come in pieces under the regulations and say, all right, within the zoning overlay, we are now asking for site plan on this component versus this component. The regulations still preclude us from advancing certain activities at all until other conditions are met. So as a master developer on this site, for instance, it would be our hope that we would have the flexibility to say, hey, listen, the residential component of this street grid and the parking solution is ready for approval. Can we bring that forward and lock that down within these rules, and then step forward at a later point, but obviously from our perspective, time is money, so not much later point, and say, okay, now these commercial pads are ready. And it just gives us the opportunity to kind of do this without, in the context where there might be multiple parties taking on various components of this within the rule book, not having to literally bring everybody all at once.
Right. Fair
Is that a
enough.
fair characterization from my team in terms of kind of how we looked at this?
Fair enough. As we talk about phasing and we talk about parking structure, which is obviously a large investment that would satisfy parking requirements for a lot of the property.
Yeah.
I'd just be curious to understand the phasing perhaps a little bit better.
Well, the good news on the parking structure is it's basically integral as designed right now to the residential.
Okay.
So it either gets added at that stage. We have either secured a adjacent parking solution acceptable to the city, or we haven't at that stage. And it doesn't mean we don't ultimately, but that parking as depicted in that plan is integral to those 4 buildings, and it's the only structure that's depicted. It doesn't it's inconceivable to us that we would come forward with kind of Zone 1 there without that figured out.
Okay, thank you. With respect to the 20-foot setback, and I suppose maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about the hotel as well, which seems to be a theme. As we look at the renderings, it is curious to see the 115-foot hotel drop down steeply to the food and beverage restaurant. And I'm curious if there would be opportunity to shift massing from the hotel to the restaurant as a means to bring the building height down and extend the massing horizontally.
Probably I'm going to go to this image so that we're all looking at the same thing. Oops, where is our pretty picture of, from a distance? There it is.
There, yeah.
It's been our belief from the beginning that the answer is yes, there is that opportunity.
Okay.
There is that opportunity.
And I ask because you mentioned...
Cut to the chase. There is that opportunity.
Okay. You mentioned in the, actually on this slide with the hotel pad comments that you'd like to explore the building massing, and it sounded like you'd rather do that in the site plan process, but then you also said that you'd be comfortable with some of those regulations ahead of the site plan process. And I'm curious, would bringing down the height allowance for hospitality and extending that use to the, what would that be, the west?
It's to
if
the
that
west.
would alleviate some of the massing, or the height concerns for the hotel.
I think it's conceivable.
Okay.
I'm trying to think on the fly about how those things could be offered as alternatives without constraining the outcome at this stage. And the reason for it, so I studied, yes, it's conceivable. It is also conceivable, and we've had approaches and interest from very capable F&B as well as hospitality groups around this, that those activities want to stand next to each other but not be integral. And so all we're trying to do is create a universe where we can get to the best result for the development and for the community without unnecessarily constraining that. But Councilman, you point out an obvious opportunity. I believe it would permit for some lessening of height if the building extended over that. I think there's some logic to that.
Yeah.
And I think that, if I would say, is a more, I think meaningful conversation than setback per se.
Yeah, fair enough.
Because I think setback is, we're dealing with site constraints.
At the 115 feet, I just get concerned about what the shadow effect is. I mean, to the restaurant, even in the morning hours, your Sunday brunch is just in the shadow.
Yeah.
That path is almost entirely in the shadow, I imagine, year-round, or through the day as the sun moves. But, yeah, I'd be interested in understanding what could be shifted as we move forward and what that looks like in supplemental regulations.
Again, I've got people smarter than me behind me and smarter than me in front of me. I think what we're trying to do is
I still haven't perfected architecture on the fly.
Yeah,
either,
we're trying to figure out a rule book that gives this team the comfort, our team and yours, the comfort of knowing that we've got a mechanism for having this discussion. I think it is, it's certainly a direction we could go. And I think without undermining the economic vitality of the resource, I think is what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, good. I'd be happy to consider that as we move forward, along with some more assurances of the parking structure. I think those two are great additions. I wanted to make sure we talked about lighting in the dark skies. The Planning Commission, along with the Energy Commission, are partnering on some new zoning regulations around lighting. And I just wanted to understand kind of the timing or the effect on this rezoning or in subsequent site plans? Maybe Mr. Leonard or Mr. Kowalski?
So I don't know exactly when that will be ready for consideration by either this group or the city council. My, I guess my recommendation is if it's something that you want to ensure is applied in the zoning framework of this property, it'd be appropriate to include some reference that dark skies compliant lighting would be required for any physical construction on the site.
Do you all deal with dark skies in other communities?
Yeah, we've actually, some of our stakeholder meetings, we had some actually extended conversations about it. I think we're comfortable having whatever rules are being generally applied in projects of this scale. We always get concerned, and everyone says, well, you know, why do you worry about PUD? As a developer, you worry that it winds up becoming kind of a Christmas tree of great ideas, and we're still we would be delighted if there was a zoning classification that would allow this project to happen, but we know we need to kind of create rules. If those are being generally applied in other zones with these uses, we don't want to be an exception. We just don't also want to be sort of the poster child for every latest and greatest idea.
Yeah, and it's something that's moving through the process of 2 commissions, and I've heard other council members discuss it. So it's the direction we're moving as a community.
And I will just say, Councilmember, I would just say that it is something we have looked at very seriously. We tend to, in our developments, like to humanize lighting. We sort of think a lot of developers overlight things. Sure. And so we're taking it seriously, but we prefer anytime there's a guidance in the regulation that we be asked to kind of live within that.
Okay,
guidance.
great. I really appreciate your receptiveness. In the supplemental regulations, the 60% of area the allowance to be impervious, is that the entire parcel, not just area 1 or 2?
That's the whole site.
The entire parcel.
That's the whole site.
Okay. Okay. So I'm hearing kind of 3 potential amendments as we move forward. That will help, I think, alleviate concerns we heard from the community. I love the parking structure. I'm hearing dark skies, and then potentially lowering the hotel height and encouraging that massing to shift to the west. But I also recognize that not everyone has had the opportunity to ask questions, so just wanted to summarize. I'm hearing those 3 general ideas.
Commissioner Gabrandel.
I would rather not be too prescriptive about shifting in one direction or the other, and I know you're looking for rules to be able to make your lives a little bit easier in terms of following something. But one of the downsides, I think, of our, especially downtown development guidelines is all the buildings start to look pretty similar after a while, and I think I probably don't speak for myself in saying we would actually really welcome some creativity with the way that you handle the massing. And that I think what I would, if I were be so bold as to characterize how we have thought about things before, is to not have it feel monolithic, and to think about how to break it up in ways that make it more interesting, and that western direction is something that gives you some wiggle room in terms of how to be able to move the jigsaw puzzle around. Right. And I do believe that the restaurant can still be very distinct looking, even if it's still part of an overall building there through, you know, all kinds of, you know, you're designers. You can figure that stuff out, and it doesn't have to have the same, I mean, there's all different kinds of ways you can skin that cat. Right. So I think I'd rather not be too prescriptive about it moving in a certain direction, but and this is not your site plan, and this is always the issue that we have with the area plan. But having this dialogue now allows you also to think about ways that you can attack this problem. And that I would just say, think of that entire envelope and how you can move things within that to be able to address the concerns of it feeling monolithic along the bridge, and
Right.
that it feels really different than what's around it. Because that's what we're hearing.
Yes.
I also feel like, in general, the city of Ann Arbor has really turned its back on the river, and that I think that having some retail right up there is okay with me, personally. And that I think of San Antonio and the Riverwalk and just how successful those kinds of things are. And though I agree that we, I mean, I also am right above the river, my office is, and I just saw Red Hawk today and all kinds of great wildlife that goes through there, and I completely support the need for it to remain green throughout most of it. I think it's okay also for there to be moments where the people come up close and the development comes up close, and that you can sit out on the terrace of the restaurant and have a beer and be feet from the river. I think that's okay to have that happen in places. So personally, for me, that doesn't completely put me off, even though in general, I do like it being a real corridor for wildlife and things too. So that would be my comment around that. In terms of lighting, I would say our parks are not lit at night. They're just not. And so I would say, however you handle that, to think about that Area 1 and Area 2, that we're not looking for, you know, fireworks at night unless there's an event, you know, something that you all, you know, have planned. But that, you know, if there is a bridge or whatever, they'd be crossing over into super dark land if it's light on the other side. So I think in general, the tone of our parks is it's closed at night, and that's okay. You know, so I don't think we're inviting people to necessarily, I mean, it's kind of go at your own risk in some ways for the rest of the park system. So I'd say in those places where it does get close, to think carefully about that 0.1 foot candle or whatever that we're talking about at the property line with the new dark skies ordinance.
Do you feel that way, not just about overhead, but like pathway lighting?
I think that generally speaking, that our parks are dark at night. And I think that it would be weird in some ways to have it be lit up for 100 feet and then to have it be dark again. And that whatever your terraces are and things like that, obviously those will be lit. But that the park part of it, the pathway part of it that connects to other things, I wouldn't think about it. For me, that's how I feel anyway, is that the tone of our parks in general is that they're dark at night and that they're not lit up. So that would be my sense of that, but I would welcome any dialogue from the rest of the commission on that as well.
Commissioner Briggs.
Yeah, so to carry on with that discussion of dark skies, the dark skies ordinance, as you guys will recall from our session, when it comes to mixed use, we didn't set the same sort of standards. And so this, even if we had our ordinance come into place, it wouldn't necessarily create the protections that we might think are appropriate for this given site. And so I don't think that we should rely on the dark skies, you know, or our upcoming light ordinance to protect this space in the same sort of way. I think that we might, in the regulations, want to provide some sort of basis around lower scale lighting, particularly at that, 1 foot candle, or, in that park space, and thinking about lighting overall in terms of shielding and stuff. The shielding component will come into place, but I do agree that that's important. I concur with the discussion around parking. And then I'd like to also stress the hospitality section. I think that it's pretty incredible to me that you're coming here tonight and there's this, really sort of this warmth about this project from the public around community engagement and how well the process has been going. And the only thing you're really hearing a little bit of sort of, major concern about, that reoccurring thread, is the height and setback of the hotel. And gosh, wouldn't it be amazing? I mean, I know it's overly optimistic to think that we're going to have a PUD project that is non-controversial once you get all the way through council. However, I think
nothing
really,
worthwhile is easy.
yeah, but I think really addressing this area, I mean, I think it's quite reasonable that people are pushing on this. This is, we haven't done anything, we haven't done planning around what are our important scenic view sheds in our community. That's not sort of a document that you can reference. But if we were, at least on the feedback that we're hearing here, I think we're recognizing that the river and that view in our community is important to us.
Absolutely.
And there's concern, especially that historic view going into Lower Town. This is something that's interfering with it, a nine-story hotel. And in some way, I would like to see that addressed this evening. I don't know exactly how we deal with that, but I do think, yes, there's a possibility for a beautiful, stunning building there, but I don't see beautiful, stunning buildings in Ann Arbor very often, and
Come on.
I think the project is beautiful, but I don't want to, I think that I'm a little skeptical about what that ultimate hotel is going to look like. So I would welcome more discussion around that site. And also, I think 20 feet, if you could discuss a little bit with the construction around of 20-foot setback and what that looks like would be really helpful, because I think there's concerns about both being 20 feet back, but also what that would look like in terms of potentially contamination during construction as well.
Yeah, during construction is obviously something we always deal with, but if I could address those, I think we would unequivocally like the creative freedom to demonstrate that this project with a limited footprint on that side of the river, with a bit more height, particularly given the change in grade that occurs there, which a number of these projects, or a number of these renderings I don't think immediately do justice to, would seem appropriate and inviting, and indeed become what we said when we were here last time, hospitality often becomes, which is not something that repels the community, but actually draws it together. You're absolutely right, Commissioner. We spent a lot of time garnering what I think is a substantial amount of support within the community for this mix of uses. So on the one hand, what we've heard quite a bit from our nearly 40 sessions outside of this room was people are excited by what the hotel and the F&B can do at this moment in the riverfront. This image was merely intended to try to say, listen, this is by no means walling off the river. The image that Hamilton Anderson used to create this was taken from a photograph last week, reminding that there's another monumental structure right there, and it's the bridge itself. And so this is below that point. The bridge sets pretty high above it. But we understand that. To my way of thinking, in listening to these comments, it seems that there's a great deal of consternation about the height itself, and then some questions or concerns about 20 feet off the river. This is depicting 20 feet off the river right here. And remember, what happens is you turn that corner as you open up onto this remarkable site. So there's a moment here, and I'm not going to try to suggest there isn't a moment here where we're tight to the river. And I do agree with the point of view that moments like that are worthwhile in a riverfront sometimes, if they're done right. I would, to be completely candid, I would rather not have the height of this particular property become the lightning rod, if you will. We would rather have the commission say, gosh darn it, if this thing were a story lower and we had a design process that would allow us to revisit massing and those things like that, keep moving, we would certainly, consider that reasonable feedback and something we would work on. And we'll be the first one to come back and say, geez, we tried to do it and the hotel doesn't work. So, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. So I just think we've established a dialogue here. That dialogue isn't going to end. And the last thing this group and the interests that have been assembled around it to make this project happen, it wants to be is a group that looks at a project where we see all of this obvious benefit and everyone saying, yes, this is the right mix of uses on this site, and we just become, Don Quixote chasing a windmill for an extra story on a hotel. We're just not built that way. We think we could make the case for this, but at the same time, we would rather hear from this commission say, see if you can work it out this way. If you can't, you can't. I believe there's some flexibility on height. Quite frankly, we've said that already. We think that this height in the end, in a properly designed hotel, would not be offensive to this body or to the community. But I would rather make the case for an 8-story hotel or a 7-story hotel, and still be able to make the case for a hotel, because I think that it really brings something to this site and this location that I want to have that opportunity to present, and knowing that this body can still say, not approving that development in site plan.
Could you respond to the question about construction next
I
setback?
apologize
That's okay. And then I would also caution, I don't think you're going to find much sympathy going from 9 to 8 stories in terms of people's perceptions.
I was using that as a point.
No, I know,
I
but
don't
I'm
know
just,
what's.
I'm just saying.
I agree. I think if I came in here with an 8-story hotel, everybody would complain.
Yeah, from your perspective, that's a really different. From the community's perspective, I think it's thinking about what that view shed looks like. So.
I merely want to remind the body that the residential buildings are 6 stories tall. So we're really not talking about night and day here. And I think probably we've done ourselves a disservice with that rendering, quite frankly. So the buildings are 6 stories. Those are, I think, 80 feet. We're talking about a hotel at 115. This isn't single-family homes and the Statue of Liberty. I mean, these are in a range. And so as it relates to construction, there is a period where that is creates certain inconveniences. I would simply say on this site, it's creating 0 inconveniences because no one has access to the site right now. I can tell you that our mindset on development of this property is moving in the direction particularly aligning the environmental remediation, which is the first thing we have to do with the development, is to create, if we're able to move forward, create the public space first, fence everything that is non-public space, since our regulations require certain things to occur before a C of O anyway, and then move back from that. So kind of create the public access experience and then have the development occur after that. So our hope is if we do it that way, we're first giving something before we're causing kind of constraint at that location. But right now, that hotel and all these buildings are in a location that the public can't access at all. So I don't know if that answers it.
I guess I'm mostly interested in the impact of 20 feet off the river isn't very far for a large building. And so I'm curious what the construction, since we're talking about setbacks of 20 feet, what the impact of that could be on the river or during construction, because to me, that's problematic.
Well, I think if you think about 0 lot line construction, which this is not, obviously, if you think about the kind of construction that's going up in city centers around the country, and frankly in our own here, we're accustomed to building in a constrained environment. I'm not concerned about negative impacts to the river during that period of time. I was simply responding to the fact that obviously there's no access between the building and the river during that period of time, but there's none now. We're very accustomed to 0 lot line development. This is considerably more generous than 0 lot line development. So I'm not concerned. This is slab on grade construction, and so it's not like we're digging a deep foundation and building up from that. So you create a pad and you go up. And so, in fact, a lot of hospitality development, and particularly in the kind of strata that we're talking about here, is pretty rapid construction these days, because a lot of it is made modular now, and that advances construction more accurately. So I'm not overly concerned about that, but that's how I view that.
Commissioner Trudeau.
I'll come back to some of the points we've talked about, but I'll switch gears a little bit. Just a couple of questions I think I know the answers to, but I just wanted to confirm. The first is on the emergency access.
Yep.
I did note it says permanent secondary access is required, so we don't know. I think the park part I'm not worried about. The Amtrak side, we don't know what's going to happen
You
the
do
train
not.
station one way or the other. So I'm assuming whatever is going to happen, you will have an ironclad easement
Absolutely,
or something.
yes.
to
The train
maintain
station.
access. Yeah.
But no, the process, I apologize for, please go on.
Yeah, I think you're answering my question. but
Yes,
yeah.
yes. I mean, we are working, we had already, even before our last meeting, introduced to Amtrak the notion that this was going to be required, and it's within the range of things we're asking them for, which is access under their site to bring utilities to the site, access, changing their access point to the far end, which actually opens up this passageway. This struck them as a pretty obvious thing, and something they certainly, again, particularly when we started with the can we drive over the tracks, and they all fainted. They said, okay, how about this?
That was my first thought. So moving to the Conservancy, so I appreciate the additional detail there. That was something I had some questions about, and I appreciate the commitment of money, because that was my primary concern, is we get all this stuff and then we don't have a way to pay for it. Having that deposit to get it up off the ground is good. I'm curious about, and maybe this is a question for staff, or maybe because it's not really clearly defined into how we're going to select the representatives, what the board is going to look like, what's the process that goes through to actually kind of stand it up and figure out what it looks like. We probably don't want to describe that whole thing in the zoning regulation. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that, or if staff wants to chime in on how that happens. Yeah.
We have some thoughts because we're doing it for Detroit Park right now with the city of Detroit. So we're forming a 501c3. In that instance, the city of Detroit said we want to have X percent of the representatives on that Conservancy board. They didn't want to say the board can only have 9 members or 10 members or 12 members. They said they wanted 3 who were designated by the city, either mayor's office or city council in there, because there's a different structure. Our attitude, once we, in that structure, agreed to that, was you tell us who it is. And so, our view of it in the regulations was let's establish unequivocally the formation of the entity, that it's board-driven, and that there will be city representation, and leave it to the city to identify who and how. We assumed it would be somebody in the Parks Department minimally.
Sure. All right, I'm gonna think about that for a minute, because I could see, always thinking worst case scenario is like, sure, we get 10 reps from the condo associations and then 1 rep from the city, and the condo runs it. And also the ongoing funding, like there's no stipulation there one way or the other. They'll have a budget, they'll get money from somewhere. There's no ongoing commitment beyond the initial $1 million.
Well, it's a combination. Actually, I think there's 2 commitments being made here. Okay. One, we're committing to a baseline of improvements that we just simply have to pay for.
Right.
We stopped short of the entire list because some of those things involve an operating model, in some cases, that still has to be worked out with the city, for instance, the livery. So there's 2 things I feel we did in this. One was we're building this park for all intents. It's got to be at least 6 acres. It's going to have the border-to-border trail. We have to come back and say, here's our plan for that. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it's made out of. You all have to approve that. We will have a point of embarkation for watercraft. We will have 2 other points of embarkation. We're sort of laying out the bare minimum here, and that bare minimum is itself millions of dollars. And then we're saying, and we're going to form a conservancy for the operation of that public space. And on top of all of the other sources that we believe we will drive into that exercise, fundraising, sponsorship, naming, the things that typically occur in these contexts. And by the way, condo association fees, which will help support this park, we are putting $1 million on the table. So again, beginning of the exercise, what we wanted to eliminate was any question of substantial commitment to this exercise. And so I'm not going to suggest, Commissioner Trudeau, that it's the end of what has to occur here.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm a little less concerned about the money than just maybe a little more clarity on what the board looks like. But I need to think about that. I'm curious if anybody else has thoughts on that. I think on the, one of the public speakers mentioned a potential different mix of uses. Just to address that point, I think an office use here would be way worse from a traffic perspective. Like the traffic load is exactly the opposite. What we want is drawing lots of cars in exactly during rush hours rather than putting housing near our big job centers at the hospital and the university. And yeah, just the pattern of trip generation with residential and hotel is much more spread out, and having a more 24-hour presence on the site rather than a limited time of the day, I think all speaks well to this mix of uses. So I'm pretty comfortable with the residential, hospitality, retail, restaurant mixed use. I just wanted to address that point. And then getting to sort of whether we want to require any sort of use, I'm really uncomfortable with that idea of saying we have to have a restaurant, not only because we're writing the zoning rules here. We're not, this isn't for the next 10 years. This is for the next however long this parcel is zoned this way to be developed. And that severely limits the ongoing reuse in the future of what might happen. We might, in 40 years, want to see something completely different here. And like how much do we want to tie this to a really, really specific vision? So I'm very much not comfortable with that. As much as I really, really want a restaurant on the river here, I walk down here all the time, and we would be there all the time if there was a good restaurant here. Which goes to my second point, coming back to the proximity of this stuff to the river. I agree with the point that having, some built environment and human presence in a limited footprint up against the river, it can be a really good thing. And I think I've heard that through a lot of the public discussion too. A lot of people have found that idea appealing. Keeping it limited is good. I think the placement near the bridge across from the old, whatever that power building is, I don't know what that actually building is on the other side of the river, but having all of that built environment concentrated right there in one point makes it feel like the right space. I think 20 feet, one of my concerns was like blocking, I think was a good point of not wanting to block public access to the riverfront, I think is a good one. And having the 20 feet to me feels about the right amount of space to make it feel like it's still open, but have that presence up on the river. So that doesn't bother me.
And by the way, I do want to point out 10 feet off of Broadway, we added that too.
Yeah,
So it's
and
not just,
either way, that doesn't, because the bridge is right there, it doesn't bother me so much either way. But the 20 feet I think is good from my perspective. Although this whole conversation really does highlight the frustration of doing an area plan versus a site plan, as we're talking in these generalities, and I understand why this is super complex, and trying to get it too specific too soon makes it really hard to actually realize, and I think that's legitimate. But it's going to make this conversation really hard because we're reacting to a lot of theoretical, like abstract things, and the concrete is what we really care about, and if we give up too much control too soon, then we have a harder time dealing with the concrete when it comes back to us. And so I don't have a strong sense of what I would even want to support here, because I do think there's some value in leaving some flexibility for design creativity, because I think there's a lot of different ways this could look great and a lot of different ways this could look horrible. Like the rendering that you showed, I think looks bad just because it looked very impermeable. Sure. It's like, I don't want to be walking on a path and seeing like a workout thing that's just like a wall, basically the wall of the side of a hotel. Like, I would like the building to feel like it's open to the riverside and to the path, and accessible, and not just a building there, even if you can see into it. But that's all design level stuff that we're not really discussing at the area plan level, and I don't know if we can really regulate clearly enough here. So I'm uneasy with it, but I can respect it. We're like wanting to preserve that flexibility. I'm eager to see site plan or site plans so we can have a little bit more concrete discussion about some of this stuff. Yeah, so anyway, those are kind of my thoughts on what's come up so far.
Commissioner Weatherby.
I think just to make the discussion on the height a little more probably complicated, because we don't all agree. I think what worries me, and this gets to the site plan, is I would sort of hate to see a long 6-story building that blocks a very large chunk, rather than a slender 9-story building that might feel tall, but only block a very small part of the river. Right now, when you drive over, you don't really notice the river a whole lot, because it's the way the bridge is and the way the site is. I really would hesitate to sort of say, we only want to get, this height, because I feel like it might end up being a big block that really interferes much more with the river. And so I definitely agree with some of the comments of, if we're too prescriptive now, then we might be unhappy with what comes out at the end. So I guess that's my thought on the height, and I know that the neighbors don't like the height, so I want to be respectful of that. But I just worry, I mean, you need to build a building that is worth it for you to build, and I worry that if we're too prescriptive on one side, that it might make that building less palatable once we actually see what it looks like. So, back to you.
My wheels turn, and I see various ways to achieve these objectives. I mean, that's all I can say. I feel like you're, Commissioner Weatherby, you're absolutely correct that if you just simply said, I'm going to limit height, it's the law of unintended consequences. We're not trying to create those unintended consequences. I have every expectation that our neighbors who are in the audience today will be back here when we show the hotel, and if we get it wrong, we'll get an earful. And one thing I can clearly sense from this commission is you'll listen to that. And so I agree. I would rather. This is all good input. I believe there are ways to balance these things, and I believe in a realized rendering with good architecture. People will say, "Get it, I get that." And if they don't, we won't get approved. So I don't. I've seen this in action in more than one body like this, and that's why I'm not afraid of the power that this body wields, and I respect the power this body wields, and that's why I'm confident that we'll find that middle ground. I really am, and so if to give us direction that gave some comfort, the commission felt that there had to be a design step or some other exercise that we went through, we would welcome that, as we have in the past. My guess is when we get to the process of actually designing this, we'll do exactly what we did with the residential buildings in the park, and that we will reach back out to the very community that we've engaged with to date, and some of the very same people in this room, and say, what about this? So that we're not asking you to do our job of getting our own neighbors to feel good about what we're going to develop. So I understand the double-edged sword of what you just said, but I would say we are, anyone can be brilliant on an unlimited budget and unlimited
and you've
options.
Got that, right?
And this site already has constraints, and so we will be the first ones to raise our hands and say, gosh, we just killed the goose that laid the golden egg. We can't make all of this work, but I would not be here today, because we wouldn't have been successful in other projects if I told you there weren't ways to solve these concerns. We believe there are, and we would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate that to the community and to this commission, at the design phase.
And then I just had one more comment that people brought up, the traffic, which is always.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Good.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about?
We talked about it at the last commission meeting, and again, I understand there is a natural understanding when you look at a site this constrained that there's a challenge here that as one of our residents said today, it's like, I don't know how you would solve that. That's why I actually have respect for the empirical exercise that the city's engineers went through, and I'm going to give a commercial again. The community's getting its money's worth with your traffic engineers. They're a skeptical bunch, and I mean that as a compliment. But I think our engineers are pretty capable too. And what I would remind everybody is something that got said here, and I can't remember by whom, so I apologize. But the uses, I think it was Commissioner Trill, the uses here and the lack of density, and we had one letter that I know came to the commission that said they were not building enough buildings out there, and I said, please say that in front of the commission, because the reality is this is not a dense development, and the uses are residential. We can call hospitality something else, but it's also a residential use. It is countercyclical, and it is not a heavy user of traffic. We're not going to suggest that there aren't traffic issues in this neighborhood. What the traffic study, which we paid for, which was ultimately reviewed and commented on and ultimately consensed on with your own traffic engineers, made, I think, the following conclusion. There are traffic issues in this neighborhood. This development, as proposed, does not materially negatively impact those issues, but there are mitigations being put in place anyway, and those include a left-hand turn lane and a signal, amongst other things that are not as obvious when you look at this, like how we're handling traffic flow on the site. And so we don't make light of it. Again, if we can't handle that issue properly, we've got 100 and some odd residents who are as upset as anybody else. But I would say, of all the things that we've been through in this exercise, and it's not an easy project, the one that I would characterize as almost bordering on a pleasant surprise, other than, by the way, there's just phenomenal reception I think this overall development has received in our exercises. It's that traffic wasn't the Achilles heel of this project, that if we were talking about the mammoth traffic counts that were originally being suggested by the enlarged train station on this site, which I know is still in the back of some member of the community's heads, different issue. But even that project was managed in the study that had determined that this site could handle a 1,500 space parking structure and a massive new train station. This is a light touch development by comparison, it really is. And I think, and lastly, and I'll end my commercial on traffic, it's the fact that we found so many different ways to get people to the site. It's the fact that in the end, trip generation was taking into account the fact that this site is walkable, bikeable, boatable, and it's not just people driving on and off in cars. And so,
Boatable, now I have to think about that.
It's canoeable, let's put it that way. So anyway, that's my commercial on traffic. We take it quite seriously, but it is a manageable issue on this site.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Sauvé.
Well, thank you, Commissioners, for laundry list before it gets to me.
Sorry.
So I actually only have a couple details. One is about height, but in the language, it describes residential at 80 feet and hotel at 115 feet, and no other uses are described for a height requirement. So I don't know if staff can clarify that?
There is.
Good catch.
Okay.
Thank you. That is correct. The limitations that are in there are strictly for
those two uses.
Correct.
And so we do not have a height maximum for office use.
Well, there's no office use. You mean if they provide some on the site?
There's principal permitted uses, office use is number 2.
Correct.
With no height restriction.
Correct. I mean, there'll be when we come in through the site planning, but correct, we can put a height restriction on that, absolutely.
Okay. So I think that's something I'm going to put on the table, that we might umbrella, that 115 feet, if that's it, to the entire site. So nothing exceeds that. I actually don't have too much concern. I think Commissioner Weatherby hit kind of that balance, that slenderness ratio versus distribution of views to the river, and letting the design team, and it come back to site planning, we can evaluate it at that point, and I don't want to squeeze too much into this. Doing some architecting on the fly, thank you, Commissioner Ackerman. I kind of looked at the site. It looks like that building could be about 45 feet deep. And it's and 35-foot height difference. So you have less than a 45-degree angle if we did do step backs. So I would just put on the table, I'm not going to make an amendment here, that an 80-foot height maximum at the river would allow for that sun to hit those step backs, to allow more sun down to the river instead of casting that shadow across. So that could be a way of looking at a little bit of form-based code to allow some more daylight across the river. I think, I think there's 2 points of concern with the height is what I think I'm hearing. Views of the river and then the kind of ecological effects of just shadow, just a large cast of shadow. And so the step backs would, I think, solve a lot for the shadow. The views, I think, are a different thing that I don't have much of an issue with at this point for an area-based plan. So I don't know if you guys have looked at that or if you could address.
And we haven't.
Okay.
I would really respect the fact that we're thinking as loud on the fly on this. When you say step backs, and I just want to make sure I understand, are you saying you're saying 80 foot before it steps back away from the river, or step backs in any direction to create break in the shadow?
80-foot height at the river, and then it could step back, in some proportion, or, a rule of where that shadow line ends.
But would more height
from there,
subsequent to that
yes,
step
yes,
back?
yeah.
It
So-
would really just be a function. You pointed out an
Exactly.
obvious constraint here. It's a skinny site. So you
step back pretty quick. You might get one or two step backs for whatever those rooms in Terracine might be.
We see that from architectural step backs all
Yep.
the time in the downtown and in DDA districts and others, but those are usually step backs to break up the facade, not to like move the building back 30 feet in a step back, because we are talking about a reasonably narrow.
Yeah.
So I'd be concerned about prescriptive step backs that we couldn't model in
Right.
front of us. But that being said, I would rather have a rule that we could work with than no rule at all.
Yeah.
I guess.
I'm like trying to diagram
Yeah.
something out on the fly,
Yeah.
and it's feeling
I have
tight right
we
away.
have one of our
So like
architects over here.
that's
She's
where
being
I'm
very
feeling comfortable.
quiet.
Like it's like, yeah, I'm trying to architect real quick to be like, is this even feasible? And I don't want to put rules on the table that are difficult to make happen later. And I do think that site planning, we will be able to have another moment to address this. So I do just kind of want to say that
Understood.
from that realm, there is some diagramming back here to look at that. I guess I want clarification on the size of that hotel and the footprint, because that's not in here. So other than kind of the area plan that we're looking at, what is is there a limitation to the square footage of that building?
As I read the regulations as proposed, it's only on the total project. There's an FAR.
That's correct.
Okay. Those were my kind of two things. Yeah, I at one moment kind of looked at, again, the hotel, and if a hotel, there's only two, residential and hotel are defined outside of kind of the overall area uses, and if hotel had to bundle another permitted use into that zone, but I really do feel that the market is going to demand more than an isolated hotel on that corner.
Yep.
So I don't feel like putting that in right now does any good. So I don't know if I've offered anything more than schematic sketches over here to say it does or does not fit. But the height restriction to the overall project, I think, is something I might punt right back over to Commissioner Mills, who's drafting some things up. Thanks.
So I had a couple quick comments and questions. So one of the things that I'm still uneasy about is the area plan. Even though we're getting closer to what, limiting this, I'm still a little uneasy about what it'll actually turn out as. So I just want to make that comment. And further, with the regards to the height of the hotel building, and this is, I guess, a question that I've had for a while, and I'll ask staff, is there any way to restrict or to give more authority to the design review board so that if a PUD is approved, they must also get the approval from the design review board? Is there a way so that we don't get an ugly building? Is there? As long as it's not brown, but is there
Can
a
have it any color you like as long as it isn't
way
brown.
to tie it so that the board, design board approves it?
I suppose it's probably possible, but my cautions is that remember, this is writing a zoning ordinance. And so for the benefit of decision makers, both the planning commission and city council, for the benefit of applicants, for the benefit of the public, having a clear expectation of what can be realized in this district is important. My hesitation with just including something that says, and by the way, it has to be approved by the design review board, to what standard? They are advisory only now for downtown projects. They also have design guidelines which shall render that advice. If they were interested in doing that, I would want to find the way to, for the benefit of everybody involved, find on which basis those decisions would be made. I fear that just saying whatever the design review board wants is probably a little bit unfairly general. And so my initial reaction is if there were, thought is that if there were a desire for design guidelines, it might be on the petitioner to present what kind of constraints might give them the flexibility necessary as they proceed to site plan, but give you and ultimately city council comfort that those design aspects would be addressed in a way. We could explore the use of the design review board and existing design guidelines as some reference points towards that end, but I would be reluctant to just, in sort of a very generalized way, just to require that, because again, it's not pointing to what criteria would be used, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for dispute over what decisions are made in that regard.
Could we tie it to the design review board's guidelines? That they,
which ones? Which character district?
the downtown one?
There's
right.
several of us. Yeah.
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 Right. No, I understand that.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple of comments in regards to, although we'd love to have a restaurant on the riverfront, I am not 100% sure that that's a long-term sort of thing. We've seen several spots on Main Street sit vacant for a long time. And so although I'd love to tie them down and say you've got to put a restaurant on the riverfront, I also don't want it to sit there vacant for years upon years upon years. So I think we should probably leave that alone for right now. At least that's my inclination. And then there's a couple comments about the brownfield cleanup. Can you just discuss that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's, this may be running over some ground, no pun intended, that we did last time. But again, just to kind of put it in broad terms, the Department of Environmental Quality approved a response activity plan for this site that calls for a remediation to what they established as a acceptable recreational standard for the public space. That is the removal of any contaminations that the public can come into contact with in the entire zone that we've designated as the public space zone here, to clean fill of at least 2 feet. That essentially amounts to removal of all contamination that is still on the site, which, while quite extensive in its areas, is completely delineated at this point, and largely involves a couple substances. One that is sometimes generally referred to in articles that you read about this as the, quote, blue soil. It was a byproduct of an inert, very visible, actually, as it turns out, byproduct of the coal gasification process that occurred on this site for 70 or so years. It has been completely identified. It will be completely removed. There is also some residual tar deposits that will also be removed. That is the entire public space area. The location where the buildings and hardscape exist is largely where the old buildings existed when, if you recall, I brought that image, that rather grimy image of this site from the early 20th century. Those are, for the most part, foundations and leave-behinds that we will, in lieu of disturbing, we will encapsulate with a substantial cap that amounts to the foundations of the buildings, and reinforce the soil to receive those new those new footings. Vapor intrusion barriers and all of the things that are usually brought to bear when you're building out over into old industrial foundations, at the chance that some residual vapors come through will be deployed and are mandated. And then there's quite a bit of geotechnical work that was also, which is basically making this site stable. This is, of course, in addition to the over $6 million of remediation that already occurred along the riverfront to preclude any off-site migration. The current brownfield plan cost for that environmental work is in the range of $9 million. So it's where a brownfield plan with brownfield tax increment financing, it really makes a project like this possible. And so that's kind of the nickel tour, but it is the first thing that we do on this project, and it is a big part of what, if we're fortunate enough to advance this project tonight and then through the city council process, we hope to get at this year. This is our hope to really begin to heal this site in this calendar year.
Thank you. Commissioner Ackerman.
Actually, I want to hear from Commissioner Mills first if she has some amendment language.
Commissioner Mills.
Okay, I have 5. There's one, based on what I heard, I only have one change to the height, and that is should we take each of these individually?
We should.
Okay. So the first one, I'll go in reverse order then, is to change the language that says hotel and just replace that with non-residential use. So make the max height 80 feet for residential use and 110 feet for non-residential use.
Do we have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Weatherby. Discussion on that amendment. Commissioner Trudeau.
Maybe a question for staff. Is non-residential sufficiently clear would that imply hotel use, or is hotel residential use? It's not non-residential use. Okay, then yeah, I'm good with that.
Commissioner Sauvé.
Just friendly amendment 115 feet?
115, sorry, yes. It's late, yeah. Well, it's not even that late. It's been a long day. It's been a long day.
Further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? That amendment is approved. Commissioner Mills.
I'm going to try to do these in the order that I think they're the least controversial. Okay, so the next one that we'll take is with regards to parking. And so the one that I heard at least one other commissioner was interested in is changing section 4G, what's kind of purpley in the printout about the parking garage requirements, to say the surface area for on-site parking cannot exceed 50% of the required total parking.
Do I have a second?
So the surface area for any, you can wordsmith this. The surface area for any parking that is built on site cannot exceed 50% of the required total parking required for the site. The idea is to not get 10% off site, build 90% on site, all surface. That's the intent, so you guys can like rewrite it, but effectively you can't have more than 50% surface area.
Can I ask a question about
Yes.
that? Is that permissible?
Well,
As
long as Commissioner
I'm
Mills
okay with
approves.
it.
I just want to remind the commission that the original proposition that staff brought forward was that 50% of all parking would be structured.
Yeah.
And there's an additional restriction that no more than 60% of the entire site can be impervious. So we were asking for the dispensation, and we don't have to be mysterious about this. If we're able to secure parking on the Amtrak site, it would be possible to achieve the parking, not in any way expand the footprint of parking on the site, and not have to build a parking structure.
Right.
So my whole hope is, because I didn't quite understand the amendment, I don't want an unintended consequence that I have to build.
Yeah, what I want is if you, so if what we see is 50% parking effectively on this, if you can get all of it, if you can get 50% of what's required elsewhere, then you don't have to build, then your 50% lot area of, is covered, or the footprint. This is where it's weird, because we don't often talk about like the percentage of surface area that's parking, you know what I mean? Is this very confusing? I just don't want 90%, like it's still, it's a lot, it's a decent amount of parking, and it's a,
if I'm under, I just want to make sure I understand the proposed amendment, that if more than 50% of parking is required on site, then it has to be structured? Is that what you're saying?
No.
Then half of that has to be structured?
No, what I'm saying is, let's assume 1,000 spaces, because that'll be easier,
Okay.
right? From the air, right, you should only be able to see 500 spaces on site. If that's all done through, a 2-level garage, okay, that's one thing. If 500 of those spaces are off-site, and then the remaining 500 that remain there, they can all be in surface parking. It's just, if you secure 100 spaces off-site and you need to build 900 spaces, 400 of them are going to have to be over over other spaces. Does that make sense? So from the air, you're only seeing 500 spaces. The surface area of the lot is only 500 spaces. Maybe that's too complicated. I just see a situation where it's easy to say, like, as written right now, if 1,000 spaces are required, they could get 50 spaces from Amtrak. They could get one space from Amtrak.
I actually understand the problem now. I'm not
do you
sure.
Understand that?
I understand the problem now, and I understand that it was an unintended problem, and I think there's a way to fix it. I just
Okay.
want to take another couple minutes so we can
you
fix
can
it.
massage my language.
Let's use the real numbers of the site. Roughly,
Yeah.
that plan shows roughly 486 spaces. I understand the point that I get one adjacent off-site space,
And you can.
and I can serve, but what cuts in the other direction is, if I only get one adjacent off-site space, I'm still building that parking deck because I still need 480 spaces minimum because of these new standards.
Right.
So we figured it regulates itself, because I still, whether I go on-site or off-site, have to produce 480 spaces. So in theory, there's a tipping point that let's say, first of all, it's unlikely we're going to get a piece of Amtrak, but you need to protect against that, and we understand that. If we get the entire Amtrak site and are able to put 100 spaces on that site, which is roughly speaking what we think is achievable on that site, suddenly we only need 380 on site, and we're probably then at the point where we can start talking about, geez, is it really worth going up a level in parking? But the only reason why I think it's self-regulating is you still are requiring a minimum number of spaces to support this project. So I can't do I can't just fake it out by saying, oh, look, I got an adjacent space, so I don't have to build a parking deck anymore.
Yeah.
But I understand that the way it's written, you could say, well, you mixed it so you don't have to build a parking deck.
I also don't want you to max things out. Like, I don't want you to go over, right? We don't want to over park either. And so, and because over parking, there's nothing in our code that says that there's a maximum.
There's no maximum.
Right? And so, and every additional space that you require, unless you go up, it is just additional imperviousness. And I know that we have a cap on imperviousness,
Right.
but we don't want to, that's not how we want to use our land area. Like, and so that's what this is trying to
So with
to
that
get at.
understanding, and again, unless Deb has a question, could you at least, I apologize, but I didn't process the idea. and
Now you know my intent. It's
Yeah.
bad language. This is.
So, but what I apologize, could you say it again?
I can say it one more time. So that the surface area of the parking that is provided on site cannot exceed.
On site, okay.
On site, right?
Okay.
Cannot exceed 50% of the required total parking surface area, I guess. The surface area that we're required to provide 50% of the total required.
But if we're only on site, it has to, that's the point.
It would be 348 if we didn't have the structure and had all the surface parking that you see. It would be 348 spaces, what you're looking at, if that was a parking lot versus a structure. Instead of being a two-story structure.
Yeah.
You follow me?
Yeah.
You'd have 348 spaces on our site, and then we would get the remaining spaces that were on the second floor of the deck from Amtrak. So we just wanted the right to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Because then we'd have some flexibility with what we could do, maybe with whatever would be the rooftop, or, you know, we could maybe do some other things.
So let me clarify actually with
There's a
staff
different
what's
range.
intended and what's in here. So to the extent of the minimum required parking is achieved entirely through on-site parking. Now I'm seeing what's going on. At least 50% of the required parking shall be located within one or more parking structures. So if there's, again, just for ease of numbers, that's saying that if there's 1,000, because I can do 1,000 a lot easier, right? So if there's 1,000 spaces here, 500 of them have to be in a parking structure. So you're still
we're all
going to
on site.
be able to, so that's 250 on one level, 250 on another level, and there's still 500 that are surface parking. Is that right? So from the sky, I'm seeing 750 spots rather than 1,000 spots, because it's 50% has to be in a
If it's
parking
all,
structure.
if it's all on site.
Correct, if it's on.
If it's all on site, okay. So.
That's, now you got it.
The reason that this is really tricky, right, is that this is going to change because our formula is based on how many units you provide, right? Like, I don't want to tie it into like a particular number because we may not see exactly this footprint. This is exactly why you're not doing, I'm going to use just a moment to vent with Commissioner Trudeau, or maybe it wasn't Commissioner Trudeau, it was totally Commissioner Milstein, and say like, area plans are so tricky for this exact reason.
But I actually say, is it possible instead, because what you're saying, I think I understand, is just because you got off-site parking doesn't mean you can add more parking floor, more parking, you know,
more parking more parking, yeah.
So is the amendment that perhaps would achieve this to the effect of, and pardon if I've get the syntax out of order, if you're already comfortable with us achieving these ratios completely on site, that to the extent we only ask for dispensation if we go off site to potentially not build a deck, if we say provided, however, that going off site does not allow us to increase the total parking count that could be achieved on site, that gives us the flexibility to move it around without necessarily adding parking, I guess, without creating a maximum parking amount. In other words, whatever gets approved for on-site parking, yeah, you can spread it out to a neighboring site, but you can't just add more parking without, I was just suggesting that basically you're just taking that second floor off that deck and using Amtrak for it instead.
I defer to others. I mean, again, what I'm still concerned about is the growing footprint of this, not, yeah. But it sounds like maybe Commissioner Briggs has a better way of thinking about it, maybe. Is that okay, Commissioner Milstein? Chair Milstein?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a better way of thinking about it, but
We're going to fix this.
I would suggest that you raised another issue that I'm not sure that I was thinking about at the very least, about because you've provided off-site parking, you're now providing additional parking on-site. I was more concerned personally with the idea of one spot goes off-site and then all of a sudden you're no longer required. I know that you're constrained by the impervious surface.
Yeah, the one
However,
spot turns the parking deck off.
Exactly, but.
My point is that we can't do that because of the minimum parking standards.
Right, and so looking at the numbers that you're providing, where you're anticipating somewhere around 486 spaces, your ideal world is that you get 100 spaces off-site, now you have 386 or so spaces
Thereabouts.
on-site, and now you don't have a structure. Looking at that scenario and looking at this view here, what I'm seeing is, I mean, we're obviously looking today at a pretty ugly site when we look down, but I would prefer to still look down on a parking structure that ideally has some sort of green roof or something like that, rather than a big parking lot down there surrounding all of those buildings, and then the parkland on the other side. And so I'm not sure that the ideal scenario for you, at least in my mind, is our ideal scenario for that site. So I'm curious how others are feeling about, because in the ideal world, they're getting 100 off-site, 380 without a parking structure. Are others comfortable with that scenario? That, for me, that's a little uncomfortable, but I don't.
For what it's worth, and again, I'm just giving you the intent, one of the benefits of not having to do a stacked deck there in that location, it doesn't eliminate covered parking, because we have to deliver covered parking to meet the market requirements of the residential. It's a difference of what you're doing on that surface. Are you putting more cars in that footprint you see as parking structure now, or are you creating a roofed structure with one level of parking? That, by the way, was purposeful to open up the opportunity for a rooftop there that we might be able to do something with in terms of a green roof or something along those lines. We would probably have never brought this up on this point if we had thought that a covered parking lot and a parking structure were the same thing in the eyes of planning, because we knew we were either going to do one level of covered parking with another level of parking above it, or a level of parking with a roof on it. So we're just, again, trying to maintain some flexibility, also recognizing we all think parking is abhorrent, but it has to happen somewhere, and we've really done our best to put it away in this location. And so again, we welcome avoiding the gotcha that I think perhaps Commissioner Mills was concerned, or even perhaps Commissioner Briggs was concerned. I just would make the point that our parking minimums preclude the gotcha here, because we have a certain number of parking spaces we have to provide for. And if all we get is 2 parking spaces from Amtrak, we're still in a parking deck. There's a tipping point in this exercise, is my only point.
Commissioner Gabrandel.
So I walk over this bridge every day, and that parking lot is so packed every single day. And so I'm just wondering, what do you feel like is truly feasible about being able to get parking out of Amtrak?
People are parking there and walking away.
No, they totally are.
Yeah, the conversation with Amtrak is they don't believe half those cars are actually are actually train users, and they want a regulated parking lot because they know that once we build this, assuming we're able to build this beautiful development, they've got an unregulated parking lot, and it'll just fill up with cars. Okay. So there's a free rider problem there right now, quite literally.
Okay. So you can't take all 100 spaces.
No.
I mean, so that's the thing. I mean, so there is a cap here, people, in terms of kind of what's possible, because I'm not going to park a mile away. You know, it's basically has to be this spot, because there's no other spot there. So there really is a very limited amount that they can get here and still allow ridership for Amtrak. Are you thinking 100 that you could actually, is that the total lot, or what you predict based on Amtrak's assumptions about how many people are freeloading?
It's total lot.
Yeah.
We just think it creates some flexibility.
Right.
That's all. And again, we weren't trying to create a brain teaser here. We were trying to create a little flexibility.
Right. So the other piece is that if they are able to get into that Amtrak lot, that thing is falling apart. It's terrible. And so in some ways, I see that public benefit of them actually fixing up and having stormwater control on it and planting some trees and not having people parking all over the grass, which is what's happening right now, that is a public benefit that maybe, I don't know, I'm just putting it out there, because that really is in terrible shape. It really is.
Bearing in mind that all that is still subject to its own site plan approval process.
Right, exactly.
For what it's worth. And we can't count those spaces in this count and thereby take advantage of any opportunity to lessen the parking structure without that site plan approval. Yeah. So another check in the system, if you will.
And then could I just, a couple of other small things. Is it possible to do a working session with them about alternatives for the hotel? I mean, a site plan is just so done. You know, and I don't even know if you all would be interested in that, but it just seems like it gives us more flexibility to be able to have some sort of workshopping going on, rather than this is what they're going to do and we either like it or we don't like it. I don't know, is that just not we've never done it that way before, where it's kind of in the middle of the process? Or does it really not afford any more flexibility? It's just that we can make whatever these sessions we want them to be? Or do we have to have a site plan in front of us in order to be able to really review anything for these type of meetings that aren't working sessions?
There's a lot of questions there.
Sorry, yeah. There's only 6, come on, what's your problem?
So, absolutely, you could schedule a session to continue consideration of this proposal. I would probably.
Not of this proposal, like, could we vote for the zoning change, but as kind of pre-site plan, be able to do something in a forum that allows us to sort of have alternatives to look at? Because I think that really, like, that hotel could be done in so many different ways, and in some ways it's helpful for us to see alternatives, to be able to understand what some of the positives and negatives are.
Absolutely, but you are going to have to consider that site plan according to these PUD regulations.
Right, that's right.
So
Yes.
you could do that, but if something comes out of that that is not reflected in these PUD regulations for some reason, it's not
Right,
it's unlikely.
yeah.
Commissioner Woods.
I just wanted to make a comment on that piece that you just asked. And I don't know, I'd be really reluctant to do that in terms of a working session, because I think we begin to set up expectations for the petitioner that perhaps we're really not going to meet, or maybe we might change our minds. And it's in these kinds of sessions where we have a proposal before us that we're actually going to vote up or down on something. So, and maybe I'm just channeling Kevin McDonald right now, but I think we have to be really careful about that sort of process. On a different thing, I had a couple of questions about your parking thing, and it's now, we went from height to parking, and who knows where we're going to go after this. But one, if you were to build a parking structure, is it going to be public parking where it can, people can come and go and pay to park there?
Yeah, it has to be, actually. This parking, there are a certain number of spaces will be secured or reserved, if you will, for the residents, but everything else that goes on in this development is some form of public access to the building, to the buildings. It's retail, it's hospitality, it's utilizing the public space. So think of it as not unlike some private parking structures you see on city streets in certain municipalities. I'm not sure there are any private parking structures in Ann Arbor, but certainly there are in other cities in Michigan.
Right.
Pull a ticket, go in and use the parking structure.
Okay. The other question was.
Or the parking lot, for that matter.
Right. Do you want to build a parking structure on your property?
At the core of this, parking structures are expensive and not always, and they're permanent. And so we look at, and so I'm not trying to open another can of worms for the commission, but once a parking structure is built in that location, it is the only thing that will ever be built there for all time. And what we, particularly because it's integrated into the residential. So we look at parking as a necessary evil in all of these projects. And so if we're able to figure out a way to organize that 480 minimum parking spaces we need in that back area of the site without building a structure to do it, it leaves the opportunity at some future date if, for instance, the train station actually does move and there's some opportunity to do something more useful in that location, maybe some obviously at a later date with an entirely different piece of property. It creates some optionality. So we've accommodated ourselves that if that's the site, we're building a parking structure, but it's not like parking structures. People sometimes think, oh, parking structures are these great things, developers love to build them. It's just a means of parking to us.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking there's a lot of yet to be unanswered questions and a lot of, or some thinking at least, that needs to be done. So I want to continue the conversation, but I also do want commissioners, or I don't want commissioners to feel pressure to vote on something that they may have not thought through at this point. So I'm not voting, or I'm not putting forth a motion to table, but that's something that we may want to, as we continue discussing this, we may want to think about shortly. Commissioner Mills.
on this one. You could change my initial thing to be 75% of the surface area. I don't know about this one, and now that we've talked about it, I see pros and cons of updating the neighboring property versus, the neighboring, what's it called? Parking lot versus doing double decker here. And so on this one, I actually am going to withdraw and just defer to staff. So if somebody else wants to take that up, do that. I'll go through my next, I still have 3 more. Buckle up. This next one is easier. Just below that purple paragraph on page 6, it's in number 1. I would replace the last word installed with required. So this is basing the number of electric vehicle charging stations on the total number of parking spaces required. So even if they get off-site parking, they have to, does that make sense?
Correct. There we go. Correct. So we could add the link whether off-site or on-site? Is that what you're saying? If whatever required parking is used for this development, we want those standards to.
That's how many standards they, and,
Yep, we can clarify.
presumably they'll build it on site, so they have control over it, but we want as many spaces as, 1/50th, 2% of what's required needs to be EV.
Yep.
Do I have a second on that? Seconded by Commissioner Gabrandel. Further discussion on that one word change. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? And we're back to Commissioner Mills.
Okay, dark skies. This is my language that would add a new thing somewhere. You could just add it to the end, because it doesn't fit necessarily with anything else, so I guess it would be, what are we up to? What's after V? V, yes. The development shall employ dark skies compliant lighting, including fully shielded fixtures and minimum illuminances to surface areas. I'm trying to channel my dark skies stuff. That's one sentence. Light trespass, this is the thing I think is really important. Light trespass at the river or at property lines shall not exceed 0.1 foot candles. That's the standard that we have in residential areas. I think, especially if we're talking about a commercial property up to the river, I think that's really important, personally. So that's what I would propose.
Do we have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Gabrandel. Commissioner Briggs.
I was also wondering if we might want to set different standards for it's sort of broken up into Zone 1 and Zone 2, so that is it 1 that's the parkland, is treated more like our residential standards, which is, what, 0.3, right, in our draft ordinances? Making sure, right? So that's one piece.
Yeah.
And then secondly, we also have for the color spectrum management, we have that all permanently installed lighting for multifamily residential developments and all non-residential lighting shall have a minimum color rendering index of CRI 70, and all permanently installed lighting for multifamily residences and all non-residential lighting shall have a correlated color temperature of no greater than 3,000. So having those components, that's not part of our current ordinance. If for some reason this doesn't, the lighting ordinance doesn't move forward quickly.
That's friendly to me.
Those are components that
Key
would
components,
No,
yeah.
those are standards we can certainly live with.
Perfect.
Is that friendly to the seconder?
Yes, though I would say that now that I'm looking at these areas, I'm really glad you brought that up, actually. Area 1 actually snakes up right next to the river. So and I think for kind of animal movement and things like that, it's good to not even just at the water, but that little band I feel like is important. So that Area 1 has a different standard, and Area 2, that whatever we have for our, our what we're hoping for the new lighting ordinance, that it falls at that line, at the border of Area 2. So Area 2 has different standards than Area 1, and Area 1 is darker than Area 2, and so so instead of it saying up to the river,
that it says
Area
to the,
one.
to area 2, or to area, whatever, the border
Yeah.
between them. So that would be my only,
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And that point 1 for at the property line is of, if we're treating area 1 like our residential areas, which we also say public lands, honestly, in there, parklands. So this is treating it no different than any other, than if and when the lighting ordinance actually passes. That makes sense.
So can you restate?
I'm going to restate the first half, and then Erica can read the second half.
So I just want to make sure that we're recording this, that the development shall require dark sky compliant lighting, including full cutoff fixtures, maximum light trespass of
Fully shielded is usually, right.
not full cutoff.
Shielded.
Shielded, fully
shielded fixtures.
Fully shielded fixtures.
And minimum illuminances to surface areas. So there's a standard, there's a book that says these are the ranges of illuminances, and what we're effectively going for is like lighting things to the minimum that's reasonable in there, so. That one's the mushy thing.
And what's that book standard that you referenced?
IES. Erica, do you have it?
Sorry, I'm scrolling through draft ordinance and getting lost in it. Yeah, it's the, maybe we could just, it's the IES handbook. I don't,
Okay. In the IES handbook.
Yeah.
Additionally, maximum light trespass of 0.1 foot candles at property line.
At the line between area 1 and area 2.
At property line, at line.
At the property line. It's area 1 and area 2.
It's not going to be actually a property line, it's going to be,
Not a
right?
property line.
Yeah, it's going to be yes.
the area line.
The area line between area 1 and area 2.
So.
Point of demarcation.
So the intention is that area 2 cannot have light trespass
Exactly.
of 0.1 foot candles beyond the property, the line delineating area 1 from area 2.
Yes.
And
It keeps the park dark.
And what happens in area 1 from a lighting standard requirement?
So any lighting that they would have to require, or any lighting that they have would have to meet the fully shielded. Usually it goes back the other way too. I mean,
Well, that's going to apply across the whole development.
Right.
So I'm trying to understand, is there any light trespass restrictions for area 1?
That's the point 1, isn't
The
it?
point
Yeah,
one.
point 1.
Point
Yes,
1.
point 1.
Yeah.
So the whole site cannot have light trespass beyond 0.1.
Right. I mean, there will be parts of it that are brighter than 0.1, right? Like there's going to be points that are brighter than 0.1 foot candles, presumably outside people's, underneath people's porches and that kind of thing.
It's just at the border.
It's just at the border.
Right.
Going into that, it can't be. Presumably, it would go the other way too. Though I cannot imagine that there are going to be lighted things in area 1 trespassing into area 2 that would create such a trespass. Yeah.
So both areas, I just want to be clear, both areas would be restricted to not create any light trespass beyond 0.1 foot candles at at any area boundary.
At the area boundary or property line.
Okay.
There, that's a good way to say it.
Yes.
You got it.
And then could you repeat the color?
Yes, I'll repeat that, and I could just send you the draft, I mean, I could send that to you after this, but I'll repeat it out loud. But the one piece I wanted to clarify, there isn't ever anticipated to be parking in Area 1. That's anticipated to be green space, right?
Yes.
Okay, because one of the things we have in some areas is parking lights going down, but, okay. So I'll read it out loud, and then I could share that information later so you get it right. All permanently installed lighting for this will probably need to be, all permanently installed lighting for multifamily residential developments and all non-residential lighting shall have a minimum color rendering index of CRI of 70. And then all permanently installed lighting for multifamily residences and all non-residential lighting shall have a correlated color temperature of no greater than 3,000. Okay.
So really, it's just all lighting on that site, because we're
Yeah.
only contemplating
Yeah, so I don't-
multifamily and
yeah. Right. It's just pretty much all lighting.
non-residential.
3,000 we get.
Yeah.
That's usually, we never go north of that.
Yeah.
We're usually 2,700 for what it's worth.
Good.
But
No, that's
3,000.
really,
That's really
no.
helpful.
We're gonna send you a
3,000,
follow-up
please.
email about that,
Yeah.
actually.
Commissioner Sauvé.
So I support all of this. The one area I'm looking at between Area 1 and Area 2 plan is the pavilion and the drop-off area and the ramps and lighting in that area. There are events in the evening and safety for pedestrians, and how that building structure and pedestrian area abuts those two property lines, and if it might create a conflict with the amount of lighting that could be required. So I'm not sure how to address that now, but if we needed lighting on those ramps and sidewalks, if there's an evening event.
I mean, could you just say unless required by applicable code? I mean, I don't, you know,
Do we have code requirements on those
if you
things?
don't.
Currently, we do. Maybe.
I'm just putting that out there that,
I don't,
That means we're lighting up that whole area.
I don't think it's an issue.
You know what I'm saying?
No.
I don't.
okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Just want to raise it
Yeah, yeah,
before,
yeah,
if it
it's
doesn't,
worth asking.
if we don't think it's an issue, it's not an issue. I just want to raise it and then find out it's an issue.
Right, right.
Cool.
I mean, as proposed now, technically, we are going to need to see a photometric plan where there's no foot candles along that red line that exceed .1. So as long as we think that .1 foot candles is adequate for lighting whatever needs to occur there, then then I think it's appropriate. If we think that a higher level of lighting is warranted for that use, then I'd suggest some exception or call out to accommodate that.
So Commissioner Briggs did the, like,
Yeah, so
go
when I
around
was
town,
around, I mean,
so-
honestly, you can get .1 foot candles in low-lit areas, and you're still having adequate light. I mean, they can have greater light on their property. The idea is that they can't put it off or into these adjacent areas. I don't think we're gonna run into issues where within the property itself, there's not gonna be adequate lighting based on our field study.
Do you guys disagree?
No, I think we can live with this, I really do.
Commissioner Woods.
So my question is, two parts. One part is the fact that the dark skies ordinance and everything hasn't actually been passed, whether or not we are being a bit premature in terms of requiring this for a development. And, yeah, I understand that it's something that very well may pass, but it hasn't yet, and I don't want to make us vulnerable to either some sort of legal issue or what have you. The other question is, because we're looking at this, I'm assuming we're doing this because it is a PUD, and we're able to sort of expect more than we might if it were not. But because it is one whole property, and now within this property, we're saying Area 1 and Area 2, and that's basically based upon the fact that, I mean, they're not different property owners. Basically, you just sort of drew a line and said, okay, let's call this Area 1, let's call that Area 2. Is that correct?
Actually, that was
Actually,
a line that was drawn by the city planning.
Okay.
To really denote, some differing approaches in these clustering uses a certain way.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that, to be completely candid, we assume that if that site plan changes, that line might move with it, but it would continue to follow these uses. So the uses would push that line, not, but we respect those zones as relevant descriptors.
So it's the uses, not the geography or anything like that, that's...
It will eventually be geography,
Uh-huh.
but, and we think, our view of it is, given particularly the constraints on this site, which I like to remind everybody, go beyond whatever constraints this body puts on us. It includes certain things like the floodway. It's gonna
Okay.
if I had to guess, it's going to look an awful lot like this.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
So it's complicated. For example, I see ice rink in there, and I know that's a concept, but if it is an ice rink and they want to skate at night, I assume it might need a little bit more light. I don't know. But, so I guess I'm just sort of taking a cautious approach to this, even though I totally understand where we may be going with it. But again, we're sort of getting down in the weeds, so to speak, without actually going through the whole process, so.
Mr. Leonard?
The 0.1 foot candles is a standard that is currently in our ordinance now. So I don't think the commission would be going too far down any sort of new limbs with that. You're right, the planning and development provides some flexibility in asking for things and the petitioner to gain some flexibility in other aspects of the code. So by doing so, you'd be sort of creating a mini lighting ordinance for this particular property. Along those lines, if I could clarify with commissioners the benefit of the line between area and one, if we are saying that you have flexibility within those areas so long as the light doesn't trespass to the boundary, I certainly see that benefit at the property lines. I'm not sure I see the particular benefit of holding them to a standard on their own property if we're saying you have more flexibility once you're beyond that line. We're sort of creating a arbitrary lower light level stripe through their property, but we're not saying what happens within those other areas. So it might make sense just to simplify that to say, more consistent with our ordinance, that it would be at the property boundaries.
That would work too.
Commissioner Gibrandal?
I guess I feel differently because this is next to the river and it's a natural area. And so I do feel like it's different, and that, and especially the place where it comes up really close. I feel like it's, I'd rather not think about it as one property in that way, and that there are special conditions going on with this as a natural system that I think are beneficial to try to limit the light where we can. So I guess that's how I feel about it.
Commissioner Briggs?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think we already have created this Area 1 as sort of a parkland, and that's how we're envisioning it. And so I think it's appropriate that we're sort of protecting that at the boundary in terms of lighting too. I mean, we're not exactly saying, we're not preventing in terms of what Commissioner Woods was sort of concerned with, that there might need to be higher level lighting at some point, like on an ice rink or something like that. That could happen there, but it couldn't trespass off of that. And I would hope that there would be some sort of mechanisms to make sure that that was off when that area was not in use. We're not saying that at this point, but I think there's still flexibility on the site, but it's sort of trying to treat that Area 1 as a more natural space to some degree.
Commissioner Sauvé?
I guess, yeah, I would like some more clarification, because if at the property line we're at 0.1 foot candles, and, you know, in this schematic layout, Area 1 covers the entire riverfront. So we're at 0.1 there for the perimeter. That middle line, the boundary line versus property line, we're looking at 0.1 and then a 20 foot and then 0.1 again. So within that 20 feet, we could create a high intensity use along that path as long as it gets to 0.1 foot candles again. So I don't know where the drop-off is, because we could have a higher illuminance within Area 1 anywhere, as long as that perimeter, so that middle line, you can go 0.1 all the way up to 50-foot candles back down to 0.1 and create that intensity. That it's Area 1 isn't protecting the river from Area 2, the way I read the ordinance. Like, it's only at the edge no matter what, so the edge of the property line is protecting the river against itself. So I would be actually amenable to just the property line, which would give more flexibility to pedestrian lighting and those sorts of things for the amenities within the property itself. Because I don't want to hold kind of a second-tier territory to lighting design when we don't really even know what it is yet in the rule book. Is that, when I start to look at what,
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one thing for clarification, not to dwell on the lighting
Yeah.
issue, but it's in reference to also what Mr. Leonard brought up earlier. I think one of the issues when site plan, when they have to submit a photometric plan, they were going to have to submit 2 photometric plans that show 0 across this line. I don't know that that's really possible. I think that that's a real challenge. If the real concern is at the river or at that small little ribbon area along there, maybe we can address that separate, but I don't know how 2 separate photometric plans can meet at 0 along the line.
Yeah.
That would be very difficult, I think, to enforce or to practically apply. I understand the intent, but I don't know that they can accomplish showing 0 along that line.
I'm not a lighting designer, and Erica knows, and you know, Sarah knows more about this than I do because they were the one writing the ordinance. My intent is that there isn't lighting in Area 1. And so it's like, it's not going back up and back down and all that sort of thing. It's that we're keeping it as a park, and none of our parks are lit. And that if there's some low-level stuff that can happen because of some occasional use at night, I feel like this is a natural system that we need to respect too. And so, I don't know, I think maybe we're tying ourselves in knots at this point. And that we should just see what's submitted and say, this is what our intent is, and see if you can meet it. And maybe that's the better way to do it. Is so that they're not putting pedestrian lighting, you know, for 200 feet along this one little area, and then you hit the dark on either side of it. I mean, I just think in general, we should really be trying to keep this river area dark at night. That's how I feel. So in some ways, I don't really care about the ordinance as long as you all get the message that we keep our parks dark at night in general. I mean, I think that's, and this is not like a downtown, this is not the library lot.
Understood.
You know, it's not. It's like we've got the river right next to it. So in some ways, I'm kind of agnostic about whether we try to change any language tonight or not, but just so that you all understand what we're intending, that's what I care about, so.
Commissioner Mills.
And I can see both sides. I don't feel strongly about the line across the middle of the property. I wanted to make sure that we didn't allow light trespass onto the river. You know, and I think if that's the property line, like, that we do that, I think you're absolutely right. You clearly know that we're interested in like minimizing lighting, particularly in Area 1. And and what at least the rest of the language talks about, whether or not we have a dark line between Area 1 and Area 2 or not. What it does is hold you to minimum luminances, right? Like, I mean, we really just want this not to be glowing, right? So that's something that I'm okay with, but Erica's looked at this a little bit more than I have. And
Yeah, I'm no lighting expert. I mean, I'm certainly trying to make sure that we're not suggesting something that's impossible. I'm confused about the suggestion that the photometric plan would require 0 along the line. I don't think at any point we're requiring 0. It would be 0.1.
0.1,
And so the intention of from my perspective of trying to create the separation between Area 2 and Area 1 is that there is this recognition that the lighting at the edge of Area 2 is more intentionally shielded so that once it hits Area 1, it's treating it sort of like a neighboring property that needs to be have low lighting. And so it creates a different structure for lighting within Area 2, because if you were only thinking along the property line, then it's a very different potential design of lighting. I mean, we could also then set a lower standard within Area 1 of 0.3, but I think that's much beyond where we want to go with this. But I'd be curious to get some feedback if you have any concerns with that Area 2 and Area 1 and the.
No? I think we heard both sides of this. I think we certainly understand the intent. We're certainly comfortable with including something in the amendment so that people don't have to be concerned that all this got lost. If you wanted to do it one area, I think we're going to approach lighting the same way. If you want to divide that line, we're not particularly troubled by it. We respect the fact that the commission is having a fulsome debate on this topic, but to be completely candid, pleasure of the commission on this, I think we can live within it.
Yeah, and agree with what you're saying about that it doesn't make a lot of sense to have 0 at that line.
Zero
It
I
would
never
be-
heard.
Yeah, that would.
I heard point 1.
Point 1 makes sense, so I agree with you on that, too.
So we have a motion on the table. Are we ready to vote on that motion?
Can you clarify that it is, that are, right now, are we making the distinction between Area 1 and Area 2?
You are.
Okay.
You are requiring, to summarize, you are requiring dark skies light compliant lighting, and you're doing that by requiring fully shielded fixtures in all areas of the site, that it cannot be illuminated beyond the standards set forth in the IES handbook based on the use categories, that neither at any property line nor the boundary between Area 1 and Area 2 can any light trespass exceed 0.1 foot candles, and the CRI and color-corrected temperature ratings of 70 and 3,000 have to apply to all lighting.
I feel like we've memorized it.
Yep. Yep. Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Roll call vote.
Commissioner Milstein.
No.
Commissioner Mills.
Yes.
Commissioner Gibrandal.
Yes.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Yes.
Commissioner Briggs.
Yes.
Commissioner Sauvé.
Yes.
Commissioner Trudeau.
Yes.
Commissioner Weatherby.
Yes.
Commissioner Woods.
No.
Motion carries.
Commissioner Mills, we're back to you.
Okay. This is the last one. But I wanted just a little bit of explanation on this. So this is about the setback from the river. Effectively, what I would propose is that the setback from the river for buildings that include a minimum of X square feet of retail or restaurant space be 20 feet. And for buildings that do not include effectively public space, retail or restaurant space, that we have a larger setback. The reason that I was proposing this is that it ensures that anything that's built on that river, we've talked about the benefit of having public space, either retail or restaurant, along the river, and that's why we would encourage something being built there. And so we would only allow things to be built along the river if they have one of those uses in them effectively. The question is, like, what is the right amount? I don't design restaurants or retail things. So like, is 5,000 square feet like an appropriate amount in a building? It's not the entire building has to be that, but a building that contains at least 5,000 square feet of retail or restaurant space could be within 20 feet. And then it's 40 feet if it doesn't include, or 50 feet, like,
So if a restaurant were built that was 6,000 square feet, it could be built 20 feet to that. But then in the future, if they wanted to shift the use of that from market conditions to office, it would not be permitted because it would no longer met the setback.
Yes, because one of the things that we were talking about, we want active uses, publicly accessible uses along the river.
And those publicly accessible uses, are you defining as simply restaurant and hotel?
I suggested restaurant and retail, but I leave this open.
Restaurant,
But
retail.
this was my kind of compromise of like, okay, I don't. That'll work. It's a suggestion. It's a proposal. It's seconded.
Commissioner Weatherby.
So I like the idea, but the implementation, I think what worries me is, let's say it's a restaurant, but there's no door on the riverside, and it's a blank wall, and you have to go around to get into the restaurant. unlikely that you'd put a blank wall by the river, but you never know. And so, would we really get what we wanted from that? And part of this is my experience with some of the new apartment buildings near me is some of them are very active, and it's just like the entrance to an apartment building. And they're actually very active, enliven the sidewalk, feel good, kind of, but they're not public and they're not restaurant or retail, but it still gives that activity. And I just don't know if requiring it to be a restaurant or retail that sits empty without a design parameter, I worry that it's not going to do what we want it to do.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I err on the side of flexibility as well. I think one of the coolest things that could ever happen would be a restaurant goes out of business and the Ann Arbor District Library, leases the space and opens a branch, or the Conservancy next door sets up a learning facility or something. So those are pie in the sky unicorn ideas, but I feel like I do err on the side of flexibility.
Commissioner Sauvé.
If we limit uses to a building, adaptive reuse becomes difficult. So I cannot support this motion.
Commissioner Mills.
I'm going to argue my case. I just worry there's nothing that says they can't build one of the apartment buildings on the river. And is that okay? As we've been talking about, in terms of where it is, there's nothing in our regulation now that would limit that. And so right now, and again, I think that there's lots of good things in this, but this is an area plan, right? And that's what I worry, the sticking point from the community has been what happens along the river, and does this belong that close to the river, and how tall is it along the river? I think that there were lots of arguments made for why we shouldn't be talking about height, because actually I think a better metric as we think about all of these things is how much of that public walkway is shaded in various shapes and sizes. And I think that was something, honestly, when you come before us, I think that's important. But the other thing that I hear is we generally protect our river, but this could be a really cool thing on the river. I'm not sure that the community would believe a really cool thing on the river is another apartment building. And so that's why I'm uncomfortable with allowing something that doesn't have some sense of mixed use right along the river. That's my.
If it helps, because we know that for the same reasons that we talked about before about why this doesn't want to be a residential location here and it wants to be hospitality, and we know hospitality wants adjacencies to work, we are actually not all that troubled if it gets comfort with the rules to suggest that you're comfortable with that setback as long as there is what through my head is river-facing retail. I think that gives some flexibility from hospitality and other uses. I can tell you that's going to be a restaurant, but I understand you want to maintain an appropriate structure in the zoning ordinance. So river-facing retail, which could be hospitality or which could be F&B or another public river-facing use, is understandable to us, I guess. And the square footage you suggested of a minimum of 5,000 square feet in that use, it doesn't trouble me in the least. I mean, I think that's already essentially what we're programming there. So if that helped the discussion.
Well, and to follow up on my other scenario, keep in mind that like any zoning district, PUDs can be amended. So if there is some restriction and that adaptive reuse in the future might support, or market conditions might support other use, it's not to say that they couldn't seek amendment to the PUD regulations. It's obviously a more substantive review process than a site plan. But to that end, if that's a slight sort of moderation of concerns of being too prescriptive, that that opportunity does exist. the PUD supplemental regulations can be created, they can be amended. So if there were some market conditions and forces that would direct reconsideration of that in the future, because it seemed too restrictive at that time, that could always be considered, but it's obviously not an easy process.
Commissioner Mills.
Just to follow up on that, though, if we don't have a restriction and they propose an apartment, not them, somebody else proposes an apartment building, we can't then say, no, 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 we're going to change the restriction,
That's correct.
right? Like,
That's correct.
okay.
So I don't know if there's an actual motion made.
I would make a motion to amend that section 3, page 5. Honestly, this is, you guys know how I generally feel about area plans. This is one of the sticking points for me because that building is the sticking point for me in this whole thing. So that's why I don't know that there's support for this, but I feel like I need to do it so that I can feel comfortable voting on the whole motion. So the amendment would be to change it to say, let me look at it again. From the north property line, 20 feet minimum for buildings, including a minimum of 5,000 square feet of river-facing retail uses, or 40 feet for all other uses, for buildings that, for all other buildings.
Do we have a second?
The intention is retail, restaurant, hotel uses? Sure. Okay.
Do we have a second? Thank you, Commissioner Trudeau. Any further discussion on this motion? Let's do a roll call vote.
Keeping me busy tonight. Commissioner Milstein.
Yes.
Commissioner Mills.
Yes.
Commissioner Gibrandal.
No.
Commissioner Ackerman.
No.
Commissioner Briggs.
No.
Commissioner Sauvé.
No.
Commissioner Trudeau.
I seconded, but I have to vote no.
It's your prerogative. Commissioner Weatherby.
No.
Commissioner Woods.
No.
Motion fails.
Okay. I think Commissioner Mills, you're out of motions. We're back to the main amended motion. Commissioner Mills.
Since I will be voting against this, I want to tell you it's because of this. I'm worried about that particular building. I don't love area plans. I love what you have shown us. I really do. And if this is what comes before us, I will absolutely support it. But I can't support the rezoning for the area plan without some more specificity about what's happening on that corner. So please, if this passes, please, I really like this. I think that the rest of this is fantastic. Rezoning is our opportunity, right, as a board to actually, set the rules and make sure that we're seeing, and that's one of the challenges that we have. I understand the reason about why you would bring an area plan rather than a site plan to us. I get it. It's just really, and I think you guys made lots of great strides in helping to give us more certainty. That's the corner that's, I think, the tricky one, and because that's the thing that's a concern for the community, and I think a concern for me personally. I generally would like to have active things along the river as long as they're going to be active. I just want to let you know that's why you'll see my vote.
Well, we understand, and my only hope is that that we have the opportunity to bring a site plan before you, but it starts with a rezone. And so all I can say is we were comfortable with that restriction because it is consistent with our intent.
Further discussion. Commissioner Briggs.
Yeah, I would say the reason, just to give a little feedback about why I voted no on that, I'm actually much more concerned. I also am concerned about on that corner. I know there's not support here for increased setbacks at large. I'm really concerned with what the ultimate form of that hotel because I'm pretty concerned with hospitality that close to the river there. I think it's natural that what ends up on that, in that section is going to be some sort of river-facing retail. It's just, that's clear. What's not so clear to me is what the massing of that building and is going to end up looking like.
I'm going to stick my neck out here. Would a restriction against residential at that location achieve the same result for you?
Yes.
Also comfortable with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's fine if everybody else is comfortable with that.
My only hesitation would be with what Commissioner Sauvé said with adaptive, that you used some very nice words. I don't remember what they were, but something adaptive change.
Restricted use does not allow for adaptive reuse.
Understood.
Yeah,
Without amendment, to Brett's point.
Yeah, I personally would be fine with residential along that area, with lower level residential with, it's like mixed use underneath it. I think that could be
Understood.
delightful too, if some iteration
Just
changes.
trying to be helpful.
Thank you.
Retracted.
All righty. Further discussion, Commissioner Woods.
Yeah, just want to say, what is that quote, "The perfect is the enemy of the good"?
It's been going through my mind a bit.
We're all sort of going around trying to
Yeah.
get it perfect. We still got a lot more iterations of this to come, including letting our public and council have a
Yeah, I agree.
good say about this. So I'm ready to vote. I know, anybody else?
All right. I think we will do a roll call vote.
So this is
On the main motion.
The main motion amended to restrict overall height of non-residential buildings, all non-residential uses to maximum of 115 feet. That electrical vehicle spaces are required at a rate by the required parking spaces, not those constructed on site. With everybody's permission, all of the lighting requirements. And those are the amendments to the original motion that you're voting on now. Does that sound like you got everything? Okay. Commissioner Milstein.
No.
Commissioner Mills.
No.
Commissioner Gibrandal.
Yes.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Yes.
Commissioner Briggs.
Yes.
Commissioner Sauvé.
Yes.
Commissioner Trudeau.
Yes.
Commissioner Weatherby.
Yes.
Commissioner Woods.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience. And
Thanks so much.
Very
Hopefully you won't be disappointed when you see the site plan.
appreciate it.
All right, moving on to new business. 10A 595 Riverview Drive annexation and zoning for city council approval. I'm sorry that we did not take a break, but we're going to get through this. The petitioner is not here for this, so we will go to a staff report. Mr. Kowalski.
It's going to seem a little disappointing after all that, sorry. 595 Riverview Drive, it's a single-family house annexation, and they are seeking R1B zoning, which is consistent with the adjacent parcels, and the main reason is their septic is failing, and they'd like to hook up to our system. And staff is recommending approval.
Thank you. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address the Planning Commission in regards to this item?
Which item?
This is in regards to 595 Riverview Drive annexation. Seeing no one, I'll close the public hearing and read the motion. The Ann Arbor City Planning Commission hereby recommends that the mayor and city council approve the Allen annexation and R1B single-family dwelling district zoning 595 Riverview Drive. Do you have a commissioner that will move? Moved by Commissioner Mills, seconded by Commissioner Trudeau. Do we have discussion? Commissioner Briggs.
Do they have dark skies?
They do need to maintain .1 at not 0, but .1 at the property line.
Okay,
right.
good.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? It is approved. Now we move on to audience participation. Members of the audience may address the Planning Commission for up to 3 minutes. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address the Planning Commission?
I'm Ellen Ramsberg, and I live at 1503 Cambridge Road, and I want to put in a plug right now. I know that you will be considering 7851, is that correct, Packard?
2857.
Okay, and I want to point out to you that if they applied for a PUD,
That's correct. I don't know that
that's
they've
correct?
They have not yet, but we anticipate that they will.
Okay, so there is a 1840 house on that site that is one of the first houses to be built in that Pittsfield area and is well worth preserving. I would like for the commission to figure out if they can bring that to pass in this PUD proposal, and to recommend that you think about just moving it down the street to Burr Park next to Cobblestone Farm. They were adjacent to each other for these many years, and I think it would be a really fitting public benefit to preserve and keep that house within a convenient and historic, almost historical location that it is in now. So I hope you'll take that under consideration.
Thank you. Anybody else wishing to address the Planning Commission? Seeing no one, we're going to move to Commission proposed business. Is there any Commission proposed business? Seeing nobody, do I have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Commissioner Trudeau, seconded by Commissioner Mills. We are adjourned. Thank you.